Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Sense Space. I am thoroughly stoked to be holding this conversation today with my friends Tim Adalin, OG Rose, and Layman Pascal, who is a new friend. We're just meeting today, but we've been non-locally friends for a while. And we are going to be exploring a really pertinent question, which is what is the liminal web? What is the function? What is the evolutionary telos? What is the practical meaning of this project, this space in which many of us have been, all of us have been participating in to one degree or another? I want to open the floor right away. This is going to be an emergent conversation. My brain is still a little bit cooked from my feverish night last night, so I'm going to rely on these artillery weapons of wisdom that I have in the space with me today to start the conversation and get us rolling. So, yeah, welcome, gentlemen, and really excited to just paint a new canvas and perhaps have some new insight into what this is all about.
Then that was me just filling the silence because obviously that was something that struck me then. So hi.
Hello.
I'm not sure how free form or kind of professional to be. Like I could sort of give an overview of what the liminal web is, or I could just sort of surf in liminal resonances.
Can
But
you
part
do
of the
both?
fun is
Can
that
you
you
do
have the choice. Yeah.
Yeah. Liminally, I'm between those things.
Perfect. Perfect.
Well, it might be
And
good to have a little bit of structure before we completely freestyle it. So perhaps if you have some meat and
Okay,
potatoes for
I'll
us
give like
to
a
get going.
I'll give the thing that we can then ignore for the rest of the discussion. My
That's
friend Joe
really
Lightfoot
important.
wrote this article a few years ago, kind
Yeah.
of promoting the name Liminal Web. He was referring to media hubs online and the communities and the theorists and the practitioners who tend to circulate through them. I generally call it the overlapping developmental, transformational, and regenerative networks. It sort of includes, but is not limited to, integral theory and metamodernism and game B and emerge and perspectiva and the intellectual deep web and Vervaeke and voicecraft and the syntheists and UTalk and the metaware community and the neo-Hegelians and the cosmoerotic humanists, etc., etc. And like, who are these people and why are we temporarily calling them liminal? I think the general characteristics of these people is there's some kind of recognition of the meta crisis, meaning that we face multiple large scale accumulating civilization problems that are entangled and that are sourced in different drivers from different dimensions of ourselves, and that to approach it, we have to have something analogous to a metanoia, something like a change of consciousness. I think these people place a premium on ongoing full spectrum multidimensional development and complexification at the center of their lives. I think these liminal people believe that the intellectual maps we need are necessarily transdisciplinary and integrative and multi-perspectival and coherently pluralist, that there's a need for new intentional communities, that we all need to get better at moving between different modes of sense making, and that we kind of feel like there's a way to recover and live universal value that in a sense that doesn't require us to reject modern progress, postmodern critique, or the obvious plurality of contexts. And the reason we would call all of that liminal, which is a word used in art and architecture to describe thresholds and edges and halfway spaces and transitions, given the caveat that it doesn't matter what we call this and we'll call it something else at some point. Nevertheless, in Zach Stein's terms, we're in a time between worlds. We're in an interval of strangeness between paradigms, socially, planetarily. We haunt the interspace between different perspectives and sense making styles. I think we sort of are, in a spiritual way, cultivating a metacognitive interbeing in ourselves at the interstices between different neuropsychological systems. We're attentive to relationality and the generative in between that gives rise to emergent transpersonal intelligence. And we tend to draw upon concepts like that to form our post metaphysical ontologies. So I guess I'm saying we take a stand at edges and thresholds and the in-betweens of existing systems, that we're actively participating in their ambiguous transition, that we grow through perspectival shifts, and that we find in the intermediary condition itself a kind of a power, a strategy, an energizing pathway that we think might not get caught in old-fashioned ideological traps. And for me also, a lot of that is shamanic or meta-shamanic, given that I think there's a kind of a temperament or a neurodivergent style that anciently characterized archaic esoteric practitioners, in which they find the conditions of their own flourishing and authentic contribution to collective intelligence in liminal, transitional, threshold, dusks and dawns and crossroads and edge conditions. Okay, how's that?
Wonderful. Yes, please.
I think that was beautiful. You know, another way, as you say, Joe, like with the liminal web term, is this kind of blanket term referring, and I feel the same way. This kind of term referring to all of these different communities that are distinct and yet simultaneously have some sort of similarities, some sort of overlaps, and you also see a very high level of interaction between them as well, right? You'll see kind of overlaps, and even if people are not directly talking with the other communities, you'll often hear people refer to the ideas of other communities, reference there's this idea that there's difference, but there's also harmony between the parts. Another way I like to think about liminal web too is actually literally the edge of the web, with a kind of emphasis on web, where you're trying to use the web to navigate in real life, but also using the digital for real life, right? Because something I think is very important, for me personally, I experience a lot of the liminal web communities as actually kind of different from podcast content makers. Yes, they are making podcasting content, but it's almost because that's necessary to send a signal out so that others find you and to coordinate social interaction. But it's actually on the edge of the web, meaning not just like the far edge of thought in the extreme, which can, risk being self-congratulatory, but actually this idea that we actually need to use the web for enhancing in real life. But then in real life, for enhancing the web, there's a temptation to saying, oh, you can't have real community online, only in real life. Well, that might be going a little far, because I would never have a chance to speak with you fine people without the liminal web, or to actually have this kind of conversation, which actually opens up possibilities that couldn't happen occur. But there's always this kind of idea of trying to actually not escape to the web, but being 1 foot, almost like the Colossus of Rhodes, that ain't with 1 foot on two in the river, like always having 1 foot in the real, but the digital, because there's some sort of awareness that the digital provides a coordination mechanism that the real world needs, actually. Because like another way I think about the liminal web, as we've spoken about, is as a social coordination mechanism. It is actually, in my opinion, the greatest social coordination mechanism that basically has ever existed. And what I mean by that is we have the ability to coordinate. Well, here's an example. I just finished getting off dinner with kids. I couldn't fly to Australia, then Canada, and then Mexico, get all together. It would cost thousands of dollars. And I've only got, 3 hours to do this or something, right? Well, guess what? I can fit that in, and I can actually interact with you and actually have possible discussions that otherwise would not be possible, right? Also, too, a major problem for social relations is something that I like to call the introduction problem, which is usually, in order to have communities, every single person in the community has to introduce themselves to one another, learn what they're interested in. That can take like 7 years before you get to the place of that kind of dialogos, emergent flow conversation, right? Well, now, because everyone has made channels, we can actually have a pretty good idea of who the people are. And it's not just me, everyone here can have overcome the introduction problem to a degree. So you can get right to the social network effects that are a lot more powerful, right? And have a certain elevation of consciousness that goes quicker. The other thing I think, so there's a social coordination mechanism, and I use that term because I think all of this also, and I'll wait to get into this later, is that we have solved the pricing coordination problem with Hayek and von Mises, the ability to coordinate resources to actually figure out how to move around capital. but we've never created a social coordination to dialectically work with the pricing. So what has happened is that the logic of money has taken over the logic of the world, basically. We haven't had a way to train different sorts of horizons that are not basically just bound to our geography or sociological givens. So our minds basically are just shaped by whatever is in our immediacy. And you generally couldn't be exposed to different ways of talking, different thinkers, like, Layman's wonderful work on Gurdjieff or Tim's work on voicecraft, right? What is the probability that I, Daniel Garner, in Virginia, could ever interact with the particular skill sets and ideas that these gentlemen have or that SynSpace offers, let alone all together, before, say, 2017, where we get this combination of YouTube, Zoom, and all of these different things that makes possible subjectivity that otherwise wouldn't be possible, and following just the logic of the pricing mechanism would probably just fall into, well, the logic of capital. And you have people like Layman mentioned, Gaffney or Stein on the work on value, recovering value. Michelle Bowens talks about how to get values. Well, here's the thing. If you want to make value distinct from price or commodity, that's a state of mind. Ultimately, that's a way of seeing. That's a way of talking. That's a way of holding yourself, right? Well, how are you going to get training for that? Where are you going to learn how to do that? How are you going to find people that want to do that, right? Well, the liminal web is a place where people are doing that, which requires making content to show it, to overcome introduction problems and to send signals, but is not primarily just about content creation and clicks and different stuff like that. It's about new modes of relationality, new modes of conversation. The other thing is, and I'll close on this, and then more can be said about economics, because actually the truth of the matter is economics is way more reliant on ideas and communication and relationships than we realize. The idea condition is far more important than the material condition, and that's Dietrich McCloskey, solar residuals and different things. But another book that is quite interesting, because I've been comparing it with Dietrich McCloskey, is Anderson, Lena Anderson, The Nordic Secret, and Tomas also talks about. They talk about the, if I'm not mistaken, the Global Bildung project, right? Which is this big emphasis on adult education and many other things. But really, what they stress is, if you look at the great enrichment that happens in the Nordic regions between 1815 and 1950, it's pretty freaking remarkable. They go from incredible poverty to incredible success. And a lot of it is because, to say this very quickly, they basically created networks of adult education that allow people to actually elevate consciousness to handle the complexity of the modern world, right? There's a real way in which the liminal web is also returning a certain sort of like lifelong learning. Like, college has told you to do that all your life, but could you realistically do that unless you lived on a university and like that was your job, right? Like, now we have the ability to fit in 5 minutes here, 20 minutes there, meet people there, figure out our interests. That creates a realistic means of adult education that might be tapping into something like the Bildung that we've seen in the Nordic, that actually seems to be necessary as well for us to develop in a manner that just doesn't end up captured by various logics that perhaps are contributing to the meta crisis. So I think the Nordic Secret is also interesting to think alongside these thinkings. And then again, different communities do different things for different people. They have different emphasis, different skill sets, but all together, there is a chord, a kind of harmony between those differences that are pointing to the things that I think Layman put out quite well. So those are just some opening thoughts that come to mind.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. I think just to summarize a couple of the things I've heard so far, and then to bring Tim in. First of all, that sense of the shamanic. We know the place of the shaman traditionally is sort of on the edge of the village, on the edge of society, which it also reflects that metaphysical position of being on the edge between the more temporal and the world of the shamanic flight, the kind of metaphysical and imaginal dimensions that the shaman is able to go into in order to achieve certain feats of healing and recovery of people's souls and all kinds of things. But the liminal web occupies that position in a certain sense. It's an edge space within, but also on the edge of culture, where you can go and you can kind of have a different experience of yourself and what it means to participate with others. And I think that's probably one of the first things that would show up for people coming into a liminal web space, is like, like this feels pretty different to most of everyday conversation, office workplace conversation, or media conducted style conversations in the form that we've received. Yeah, and then the piece of education is really alive as well. And this is something I've been thinking through a lot, especially drawing on Daniel's work of like the liminal web or the liminal itself, liminal education as being this like new pillar of education that has to sit alongside, say, classical education and more like holistic education. And that we need kind of training spaces to be able to participate in liminality, to be able to become kind of artful in improvisation, to be able to move between different dimensions of consciousness together with other people. And the liminal web is kind of a space to do that. And so there is a process of like understanding where does this stuff fit in like a new educational paradigm as well. And then finally, I just get the sense like this is a kind of fulfillment of the potential of the web as such. Obviously, there's much greater fulfillments of what the web actually is becoming and what that all means. But in a certain sense, the liminal web as we see it now is a fulfillment of a potential that was sort of latent within the infrastructure and architecture that was available. Just as podcasting itself was kind of like this latent potential that was already there, like people had the technology, but there was a kind of shift in awareness and consciousness of like, oh, yeah, this actually can be more relevant than television. This can become almost the primary medium of communication and is much more culturally rich and generative and real than television for the most part as well. And so the liminal web is almost like podcasting live without an audience necessarily. It's like the live play space in which the art that we call podcasting is developed. So just a few thoughts there. Mr. Tim Adalin, what's cracking?
Yeah, probably a lot, but yeah, I mean, so I really like everything that's been said in terms of outlining and pointing towards dynamics which are real and important and very relevant, and certainly which I feel I have participated in. I don't necessarily share the same view regarding, collating some of those dynamics under the historical epithet of liminal web. But interestingly, I actually don't know if that conversation, if me even making that case adds much value. Yeah, it actually speaks. I think the issue I have with that actually speaks to some of the general deficit in the named context of liminal web. I think, and it's so tricky because, those listening to this, some will have, somewhere approaching the same perspective on it that Layman might have, maybe that I might have, and then of course both yourself and Jacob and OG as well. I certainly was someone who was creating with some of the voices and some of the producers, back in 2017, 2018, before there was a coinage of liminal web. And it is not my perspective that the orientation toward the criticality of care for the context of the generative relational unfolding of understanding was in fact as primary as it is sort of being imbued with here. I do think that it's also fair to point out that that is present throughout what has become named as that context. But I also think that, like a bunch of things, like the dynamics of attentionalism in general was not particularly part of the content of understanding in the early liminal web context, and the knock-on effects there in terms of how attentionalism relates to the possibility for participation, and in that sense, how to actually support subjects in contextual understanding who want to do more than simply imbibe the well-formulated content of whatever level of analysis comes through various big name speakers pointing to various deficits or possibilities in the broader systemic landscape and possibilities for self-becoming. So a lot of the content is also about, let's say, the development of the subject and development in general, but I would make the case that it doesn't, the genesis of the liminal web as an attentional context was not, its above the surface elements were not particularly skilled or particularly aware of the praxis of participating in understanding together. I think by and large they were more capable at creating content that resonated in a way that was perceptible enough to a certain quantity of people who, yes, still had one foot wanting to open up to something new, but was for sure also rooted in expectations for the reception of media in the mode of content that we were usually used to. Where, for instance, and so OG and I have shared some writing back and forth where some of it you could replace, for instance, liminal web with voicecraft as the context for consideration in terms of, the history of podcasts, and then something other than a podcast. One way I would summarize an element of that, and it's also why I'm sort of resisting just labeling, right, the liminal web as the holder for this thing, because it certainly has not been a holder of me and my work, has not been a holder of voicecraft. And that is that in this kind of conversation, the content I have to share cares a tremendous amount, maybe even more primarily, about the actual context of our sharing and understanding. The content is in service of the context. In many instances of regular podcasts, the context is there, podcast being the context, to welcome in the content of some other speaker. The context is in service of the content, it then heads out there, and OG has some excellent language where he comes at this point from a slightly different, angle, where he'll speak about explanation and address. And so what we had in the early days of the liminal web, and even then it is too general to speak about it like that, even though I never met Mike and UV from Future Thinkers. We had some, text contact with each other very, very briefly. I think they are, in fact, examples clearly of inviting people into participation in the world. And so part of this issue, and you're lumping a bunch of stuff together, it's like, it's almost not helpful, right? So there's kind of like my psychological history in relation to this is absolutely relevant and a kind of conditioning factor in what I'm discussing, but it's also not kind of possible or even necessarily appropriate to actually unfold that in a way that one could, like, I wouldn't be trying to I'm not trying to put that forward as some sort of like, this is how we should all see it, but this is how I see it. Do you know what I mean? And so, yeah, in general, part of what really got things moving in terms of coordinating the attentional ecosystems was actually a really excellent capacity to make content about the possibility of contextual change, without, in my opinion, actually leading what it was to participate in that contextual change, apart from that particular media component,
Mm.
and plug that in with a capacity for really excellent coinage and the crystallization of memes, which isn't necessarily the same thing as genuine participation in the mess.
Yeah.
And in my opinion, a lot of the deep value associated with the liminal web that actually made possible the coinage of memes was in general not brought into the awareness among those who were entering that scene in more of the consumatory way. So I think there are interesting dynamics of, what Jordan Hall has spoken about, and I don't know who the author was who spoke about senius and different things and the different stages that kind of goes through. But I've seen different cycles in relation there. And my personal view is that there's definitely some interesting stuff here, and I collaborate with many of the people, but I don't collaborate with all of the people. And in fact, the doors were shut to me to collaborate with many of the people. And in many respects, I felt disrespected at various points over the years by a number of the people, indirectly, with perfect plausible deniability. And I mean that actually with my heart, as well as with a little bit of spice of frustration. And so I care more about who I can collaborate with, who actually will meet me in conversation, who did then, what the different capacities were on camera and off camera, how much continuity there was in relation. And irrespective of the history or future of the liminal web, I feel it has basically no bearing on how I personally relate to the people I'm in collaboration and relation with. And so I'm a little hesitant of just, sharing so many years of dedication. And of course, there's been hundreds of others in dedication, maybe even thousands of others in dedication. But I'm cautious of, labeling a whole bunch of stuff that has just been blood, sweat, and tears coming back to the well, under a construct that I don't actually feel was, leading in the ways I would personally consider most important. And yet, throughout it, were absolutely leaders who were leading in that way. And, I gave up the very day it was coined on changing anybody's mind about this. It's kind of like whatever. And I actually also play along and support it in a bunch of contexts as well. So maybe this is just a footnote. I don't really care, but there's something relevantly bound up in this particular dynamic with my subjectivity. And if that wasn't welcome in some sense to presence itself, then surely the liminal web would just be a massive contradiction. Doesn't mean I'm right, but there we go.
Yeah, that's terrific. And first of all, that's welcome. Thank you. And I think unless that ambiguity of our relationship to the liminal is presence, then the liminal has no self-consistency. We were at a meeting to help put Limicon together, Limicon 2 for March over the Christmas break. And literally everyone at the meeting was like, I don't know if I relate to liminal, right? But there was something about the saying of all of that that brought us together, and something about the saying of that you could argue is intrinsically liminal, but you don't have to make that argument because I mean, I don't care. I find myself extraordinarily indifferent to labeling, both to getting the labeling right and to the anxiety that we might get trapped or misled by the labeling. I've been sort of struggling with this for a long time. When I was like deep in the integral community, One I used to say integralists and integralites, and the integralists were people who sort of bought into the branding and the concepts and the self-consistency of the map, regardless of what they were capable of doing with each other. And the integralites were people I thought of as indigenous to a new kind of thinking and interaction space, regardless of what they called that or how they acted on that. And I think there's a set of, you're pointing to this, Tim, I think a set of ways of engaging that make that difference more explicit. You know, when I first time I ever went down to an integral meta theory conference was in 2015, and I was supposed to give a talk called "What the fuck is meta theory?" And it became obvious that I didn't, even though once I condensed my talk, I still couldn't get my talk across in the amount of time they'd given me. And I was at a party with a lot of the younger people who were volunteers at the event, and this girl who was like totally drunk out of her mind said, "Why don't you just do the question and answer part?" And I was like, "That's great. I'm just going to open to the questions, any questions, right? Forget my entire speech, because being there in the immediacy of that moment with those people would call something forward from me and from them, which is a lot closer to what I want this to mean than any presentation of a one-way sort of attentional set of knowledge." As we're talking about hopefully we're talking about an ancient and futuristic way of being together that can be useful in a multidimensional sense, and we can play that into the liminal or we can play that out of the liminal, and it doesn't really matter. But I think we need to, you know, the vibe and the sensibility and the trust with each other around the clarity of what that distinction is. That's where we really have to go with this.
No, I think that's brilliant, and I appreciate very much everything that Tim said. There's a really critical way in which one of the key characteristics is precisely that you don't need the word, but the spirit of the word, and you actually are not bound by the word, and you're able to still interact knowing that there's something that it's pointing to that you don't completely like passionately disavow, but you're also comfortable to critique. It reminds me very, very much of like a term like Christianity. Like, and I think this is the problem, right? Like what a lot of people say, if they'll say, "I'm a Christian," a lot of people are like, "Where were you building the church? Where were you doing the missionaries?" You know, you're kind of inheriting that entire tradition. And actually, there's something very problematic about it. And yet here's the problem. If you don't have the possibility of that sort of exploitation, if I will, then it actually can't spread. Actually, like the very capacity of that misuse is a necessary risk, and dare I say even evil, for the possibility of people to come under an umbrella of say like Christianity and thus become ambassadors and then 20 years later actually change, right? Like that's the issue. A lot of people have to say get into a religion doing it all wrong and probably making everyone upset in the eldership precisely so that they're in the position to receive the training that they need. So at years 20, they go, "Wow, I was an idiot and actually taking advantage of all the blood, sweat, and tears of other people. Oh my gosh, what was I doing?" Right? Like this is always the massive tension of, dare I say, transformations of consciousness or transformations of how people are. There is necessarily an exploitative dimension. You also very well, Tim, said, because when I think about the liminal web, like I said, I think a lot of the social coordination mechanism, which is very intentionally playing on economics, because basically, if we look at the liminal web as a kind of movement, a kind of like movement of thought, what ended up happening, like you said, Tim, you had the phase of the explanation phase, where the liminal web was in the business of making content about the explanation. Well, unfortunately, economic institutional status incentives are that if you can be some of the first people to do that, you can actually start making money and make a career of that, and there is never incentive to then move to the address because you got the main capital. And usually unfortunately, that very much is why many social movements, if you will, fail, because the ones who actually say start talking about the return to conservatism or communism or libertarianism, they sell a lot of books, they make a platform, and they actually have no incentive to go beyond the explanation phase because they actually make a career out of it. And also the brain has a funny way of convincing you that if I explain something, I've addressed it. The brain really is very good at self-deceiving itself into believing a good explanation of the situation is the address of the situation, right? But you see, the address is stuff like economics and building institutions and actual physical things, and all of that kind of sucks. and is really hard, and then you have to take on risk, and whatever you do, some people will disagree with. So the brain wants to stay in the explanation, intentionally confuse it as address, get your career, get your money, and go about your business, right? And really, there's a way in which if a movement, let's say Christianity or any religion, I'm just picking that because it comes to mind, is because if it stays in the explanation and never starts, say, in the Roman Empire, people taking care of the poor, or during the plague, or moving into these kind of movements, it actually just dies. It's just a metaphysic, if you will. One of the reasons that social movement, like many social movements, and I know I'm moving around in language, so forgive me for that, but many social movements get going because they introduce a, dare I say, new view of the world that is actually quite good, and it probably has a lot of truth to it, right? Like a defining feature of a lot of people on the liminal web is relations are real versus things, right? Like relations have more, in a way, substance than thinghood. Obviously, Viveki, Owen Barkey, et cetera, so forth, right? That's a really good insight. That's something that Leibniz and Korbosky and all these people said, hey, guys, if y'all don't start to learn that relations are real, mental health will actually decline. One of the great books, Science and Sanity, Alfred Korbosky, is like, there is no such thing as thinghood. If you don't start talking about situation and time and stuff like that, relations, you will go mad, right? So the idea of relations being real is actually a very, very good shift of focus, right? Okay, but you have to now move to the economics. What would it look like in the material condition? What would it look like in the structure of politics, et cetera, so forth, of building communities, right? Well, that's where it's quite difficult, and you have to make that shift. And honestly, for me, like you were saying, Tim, and so like if Christianity, again, just stays in the realm of offering a new metaphysic, a new worldview, but it doesn't start moving into the orphanages, moving into the kind of structures of how people do things, then it stays as something that's pretty, but it's not going to lead to any sort of spread of change, right? But of course, here's always the problem. The moment it spreads, what can it be done? What can happen? It can be exploited into institutions and turned into governments and Constantine and giant church. And oh, crap. Like everything that can spread necessarily comes with these risks, right? But then if a lot of the problems we're facing is due to a lack of some sort of mode of consciousness or way of being that is not spreading, that I call voicecraft, well, then you have to figure out how to spread that thing, aware that the very success of doing that also necessitates various misunderstandings, exploitations, or things taking credit for things that don't have the same blood and sweat and tears, right? These are always those extreme tensions. But if like we look at, for me, I guess I want to say is I feel like a lot of the people that are still around in the space are ones who have actually moved now into the direction like that are actually more toward the redress. That's why they're still here, right? Like they're moving toward questions of materiality. There's almost been like a kind of pruning in the same way that, again, when Christianity starts, there's a lot of Gnostic texts, there's a lot of different books about different ideas, and there's a kind of pruning. You can say it was totalitarian with the Nicene Creed forcing certain texts. And that's always the problem. Like as you refine something to something that people can kind of grab hold on and spread, there almost always is some sort of problematic, could be a problematic filtering, right? But this is actually, I guess I'll stop. This is the point I want to make. What's interesting to me is whereas the movement of most new cultural paradigms, in order to spread, had to go through a kind of Nicene Creed or something where some powerful people selected things. What's fascinating to me is because of the social coordination mechanism, the Nicene Creed is online and everyone can see it and anyone can join in. This to me is a very significant difference. Because now basically the space of discussing what is this thing is open to the public, and actually no one has the final say. It is an emergent result of the collective conversation as we're figuring out. So you have the possibility in most of history, to refine the point, for most of history, you had some group of people, if it's economics, basically the world has been made by Bretton Woods, right? Some elite people got together, decided, Nicene Creed, they decided what the authoritative text or dogma would be of the new view of the world, and they decided the institutions that would be formed in light of that. Again, I mentioned Bretton Woods. You could argue Bretton Woods made the freaking economy system we're in, right? A few people. The council that is making the decisions of what is the thing that's happening is open. It is in the open. It is transparent, and anyone can be involved, and anyone can bring different books. And precisely the shine of the ideas that people are coming forward is what attracts people in that direction, where they emergently kind of flutter like birds that way and say, yes, that's where we wanted to go. And actually, people are also working their own capacity to recognize that shine and then to interact with other people toward that. That is bringing the process of refinement into the open. And that to me is very, very important for the social coordination mechanism, that the refinement of the new paradigm is not behind closed doors, because basically for all of history, it was behind closed doors. And that's where there perhaps is a new possibility. I will pause there, but I appreciate everything Tim was saying.
Yeah, I want to follow on with just one thing here. Well, I don't know if it'll be one thing. My partner said that to me the other day. She's like, you keep on saying one thing, but it's actually like 5 things. And then I said to her, I think I picked that up a little bit from OG. I think I picked it up a little bit from OG.
Oh yeah, I do that.
So I don't know. But then you added in like, I'm gonna refine the point, which is nice. So I'm gonna say one thing and then refine it in like 5 or 6 ways. And first of all, I have to remember it. Yeah. So the point about relations is obviously fundamental to this. One of the ways to, we're going to stay with it then, participate in the liminal web isn't to try and participate in the liminal web, is to enter a relationship with a person like, or a group of people. Okay. Which is kind of hilarious that something ever could take like, oh yeah, we're the coinage where the relations happen. Do you know what I mean? It's like, okay. So there's something, but in the context of, so the other thing that's worth, and I mean that in a very empowering way, okay? That's it's a very empowering thing, but it might not be recognized by the liminal web because that thing doesn't actually exist in terms of a named entity, okay? So there's part of what I would consider to be critical to the praxis or capacity of participation in the liminal web, which isn't just this, but does involve coordinating in relation, and through that process engaging in and supporting each other toward insight, ultimately to help each other see to the degree we can move into, and that kind of begins the address. I don't just mean that in the sense of explanation, not just here's some awesome frames, although that's clearly something that's helpful. It's actually in touch with each other, supporting the conditions for another to actually see with you and to share that, and now that can seem, and to move toward the materiality is an interesting kind of thing, right? So let's just, we can, that in itself is already engaging in something that I want to call material in some alchemical sense. Like, I don't think that is just because that real exchange of energy is, is critical. But in terms of then what, becomes of the making sense of the material conditions and possible, material orientation of subcultures or cultures where all of a sudden, like analyses like Game B, and then if we just stay with the set of memes associated with some of this history, the Dark Renaissance critique of that, which it would be too reductive to say this, but it's kind of helpful shorthand to just go, our kind of straw man-ish take on Game B is that it's all about utopianism, and we're kind of like, that's bullshit, so let's be a little more real with each other. Okay, but let's do that by also bringing in maybe an analysis of attentionalism, and then can we really look at the way that sexuality and power and violence show up. And one of the things that's never really been part of the what are we even talking about here, liminal web stuff is, I would say it's been mostly shadowed. It's there a little bit, but it's geopolitics and And of course, there's, war on sense making type stuff, but it's generally pretty silent and lacking in capacity to have conversations about active geopolitical influences in the relational contexts themselves, as well as in not only in the sort of mimetic space. And so, you know, and then there become questions ultimately in there, which is like, people are like, well, are people actually paying attention to some of these real power dynamics? And then it's like, oh, we also don't really have a particularly coherent philosophy on the relationship between private and public expression. And we also have breakdowns in relationships without intermediate spaces for them to take place in, that aren't as public as broadcast, but also aren't so private that they actually echo off from participation. So these are themes which have been big in the context of voicecraft that I would say, largely speaking, are not part of the historical canon of Liminal Web, but I think are super crucial, and they remain open questions. I certainly think they are. I would say basically in the way that the Liminal Web began, in terms of its sort of high content awareness, I would say that mode is insufficient to actually relate with some of these dynamics. And so then the question is, where and how and who is actually supporting that coordination in relationship to participate in understanding and helping each other see together. But then what happens there is that all of a sudden, as soon as we're really tapping in with each other, that does narrow the, appearance of relevance in the form of well compressed memes to a broader audience. And then, it does seem to me that we're in some process of cultivating a kind of strength of attentional capacity, given the broader cultural paradigm we're in, that preserves the address, but there's always these boundaries. I personally often find the experience of even these conversations very unpleasant energetically as well, because relative to what it would just be for us to have this conversation as the four of us, but they always have been for me. And so maybe that's, maybe that just is what it is. Maybe I've got slightly more of a personal disposition towards that. But I do think that the kind of vulnerability required to it's not so much thread the needle, to, continue to basically give what one can and what one feels called to the truth and the possibility of truth and beauty and goodness and all of that as part of the relational field that we are present with here, but to do so in a way that also makes one accountable or renders one's self vulnerable, basically by virtue of doing that. Like, here are my actual edges. Like, here's what I'm actually struggling with. Like, so there's that. And then there's also an educational thing, which is that to support others into insight isn't to speak the thing for them. And so it's often not about nailing the content and the memes. It is actually about opening oneself up to another, bringing that song to its point of ecstasis. And that is also what is, well, they say you have interviewer dynamics that in principle are kind of meant to do that, but it's kind of reversed almost. Yeah, like the kind of podcast I would be particularly interested in, is one where the guest, in fact, is so much a part of the process with the interviewer that it's, well, who is this imaginary interviewer, hey? Just sitting, just observing, the one outside it all, providing. And so with that, do I bring it to a close, open it back up to all of you? And of course, in this case, Mr. Jacob.
Yeah, appreciating your honesty. It's very illuminating. Um, I think a few things that are coming for me is, well, the dimension of soul comes up for me, like the sense of the soul's journey feels like one of the sort of closer to the core meanings of what this can really be about. One of the questions that came up for me earlier was like, well, who or what is organizing all of this? You know, who, what force, what sort of self-organizing, elegant quality is causing me to find people who, you know, help my soul to realize itself in the world. And that, I'd say, really points to the starting point for me in all of this. Before the Liminal Web title comes along, it's really like the search for people who feel like animated by a kind of wisdom that I am drawn to on some deep inner level. And so I want to move closer to that. And I think you pointed out very well that in a way, and Daniel's spoken to this as well, like you have television and then you have podcasting paradigm, which is sort of like a more authentic one-to-one space, but you can still be the fourth wall and you can still be a kind of non-playable character. And so the liminal web, or what that points to in many ways, is like the shift from watching to participating in, which is the spirit of voicecraft. And so, yeah, that's when I'm just trying to think, like, if I was like to step out of this conversation and take a strong entheogenic substance and sort of go up above and kind of get the view from above in a very strong sense, like from that landscape of relevance, how would I understand what the liminal web is outside of kind of the intricacies of being inside of it? It's interesting. I struggle with that Christianity comparison, I think, because the liminal web to me seems to be a kind of tool or a kind of intelligence that functions very mycelially in relation to a wide variety of institutions and cultural frameworks and landscapes, and is kind of this thing that can kind of like come alongside and be in relationship with whilst not being fully of or fully defined by. And of course, well, a lot of these institutions and religions suffer from a lack of that kind of space of encounter to find somebody who's really interesting and can kind of vibe with and understand the world that you are in, but is also somehow holding a space beyond that and is willing to be in the dance with you in a way that, allows you to mutually together come to some new realization. And that's just it's a very poetic, that's the poetry of dialogos. Ultimately, it's almost self-evidently beautiful thing to participate in. And I would say is the very bread and butter of what makes the liminal web relative to, even this kind of like expert class kind of content, whiz kids type thing that you've pointed to, Tim.
Yeah, I really enjoyed in what you were saying, Tim, the kind of creative tension that exists between performativity and vulnerability in all these spaces. And I guess I kind of think about the liminal web as the redemption of reality TV, or like we've entered into a phase of bioinformational civilization where things are half real and half electronically mediated. And the question is, can we live coherently and multidimensionally as real human beings in that space? And how do we make that weird juxtaposition somehow inherent to the authenticity of what we're doing rather than a danger to the authenticity of what we're doing? And there's a lot of different, we're all improvising strategies for that. I went on or I don't know which podcast it was on, but Greg Henriquez and I sat down and he'd been telling me about his UTalk based wellness profiling system. And I'm like, let's just do it. Like, literally run me through your psychological profile and I'll tell you about my life and my trauma and my sexuality and my relationship to God. Let's demonstrate it. Let's put ourselves a little bit at risk in these spaces. What I've noticed in interviews on the integral stage I've been doing lately is usually about two-thirds of the way through, I just stop and say to the guest, okay, you ask me some questions now, right? Like let's see what else we can do with the format that we've been given so that we don't get trapped in the ideological effects of the most superficial version of all of this, given that this is the new world space that we're all inside. Something else that came up for me is somewhere between uh, the OG Rose affirmation of the messiness of Christianity and Tim's sense that he was disrespected by some significant players in this space is the question about who's in the space, right? What's the membrane? What's the boundary? Who do we count? And how do we collectively hold the diversity? And when does somebody shade out? When does somebody shade in? When do we take the risk of including someone? And how do we figure out the vibe that we use to adjudicate who's in this space based on how we mix together all these different sub scenes that are a part of this? Right? It's a big question on the integral stage, which is like, what's the minimum viability for someone we talk to, given that we've set ourselves the task of talking to anybody in the conversational topology of this space? Is there anybody we shouldn't talk to? And we're always in discussion around that. My sense is I want to cast a really wide net, a really big thing. Like I always say, if Hitler or Ted Bundy had a meta theory or a take on the liminal space, I would definitely talk to them. I'm not worried about the platforming question, but I think there's something that arises through a very diverse set of conversational engagements that gives us a sense of the flavor that we then use to adjudicate sort of who's more in and who's less in. And it's not like Daniel was saying, we don't really want to have this closed door thing. But at the same time, there are different degrees of involvement in all of this. Like we're all not just talking on screen. We have lives and families, and there's in-person events, and then there's behind the scenes conversations about who do you actually trust, that kind of stuff. So there's a broad superficial inclusion, but then that teaches us something about deeper levels of who we think is actually not a member, but a real participant in what we're doing.
Yeah, yeah, 100%. Um, yeah, Daniel, I should
Yep.
maybe maybe let you go here.
Please,
I
Tim, please.
okay, okay. Yeah, I think it's probably worth me clarifying that while, you know, necessarily there are, you know, particular characters that my psyche would want to cluster, let's say, moments or dynamics of disrespect on. In no way would I name them in this context because so much of that is my own projection. Not all of it, in my opinion. But what the hell? I don't even know. What is projection really? Like, it's not just, you know what I mean? It's kind of all projection in some sense. And yet at the same time. All right, so I'm obviously just joking a little bit there. But there's also bound up in that actually the kind of distributed ways and distributedly held but also reliable ways that I've come to know how I can be perceived and misperceived, or some combination of of both, which seem much more to belong to a collective sensibility or a collective capacity for perception that then might end up being manifested at certain points in particular people, those people are not necessarily the genesis of that. And so it would feel to me deeply inappropriate to even name any names, because that energy should not be directed there. And at the same time, obviously, I bleed blood and I interact with people, and not just something as diffuse as some collective sensibility. So that's worth clarifying. There's a couple other things there, but yeah, there's a lot there. But OG, over to you, mate.
No, I think that's magnificent. Well, there's a way in which the time is that, in a way, the liminal web has burnt off, or is burning into almost, we could say, the participatory web, a web that you participate in, and that is fundamentally characterized by a participation. Because literally in a conversation like this, one of the key characteristics of anything regarding the liminal web is that you actually can kind of forget you're online. That's kind of the liminality of it. I'm just talking with friends, right? Oh, I guess we are recording. Oh, okay. That you're actually learning to get to a place where you're fully participating in something. And then as you do it, one of the reasons I think people come back in this space to these conversations is because you know something has happened here, and you remember things have happened, and you know there's some hard to put into words way that you've changed, or ways you've learned how to listen, or ways you've learned to open to different forms of communication. And if someone asks you to make a list of all the benefits you got, you couldn't say, but you have a sense and memory of it, so you keep coming back. And I do think that's often a characteristic of the best relationships, the best churches, the best religions, this sense of, I know something has happened. It doesn't always happen, but I have to be faithful to the returning of it for its possibility, right? As an end in itself. And this is why you can't be primarily about content, because if you're primarily about content, there's something like, if I do it for that reason, then I actually don't have the thing happen that I know can happen, where I somehow become more human. Likewise, if I'm, say, in a religion to prove to people I'm religious, or that I'm a good person and not bad, then it becomes idolatry, right? So there's some sort of self-forgetfulness that is at the heart of all of this, that the participatory web, dare I say, that starts as the liminal web, because that's the explanation, that then melts into a participatory web that I call voicecraft, is basically precisely where you are looking for that, but that faithfulness to that process in you that you sense is really important and that you need, that then you bring to your everyday life. And if you're not here to do it, you don't have that, right? Because I would say another reason why people who are still here after 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 or whatever years of creative writing, like I can say from like creative writing for 20 years, you do it because you know it does something that actually changes the quality of all of your relationships in real life, rather at Food Line, the hardware store, at Thanksgiving dinner with your kids. You know there is some quality that is gained that is hard to put into words, because if you could, it would be quantifiable and therefore not primarily quality. And we're under the reign of quantity, as we've heard, that leads to all sorts of tensions. Very fair point on the Christianity that you're saying. I guess I make that example, Jacob, is because, you know, there's a lot of people where Christianity splinters into Orthodoxy, Catholicism, Protestantism, splinters off into denominations. And it's also very interesting that the first Christians weren't Christians. They were the way, then they were called Christian. And actually, many Christians to this day say the problem is we need to get back to Christ, and Christianity is in the way of Christ. I think about a Simone Weil. And there's often this, how do we get back to the Holy Spirit, right? There's this sense that Christianity has lost Christ, or it's lost the Holy Spirit. Like you're saying, the liminal web is primarily to you about the dialogos. Yeah, how do we get back to that versus end up in the liminal web like Tim's talking about, that actually just becomes content performance and is actually then making things that are more careerism as opposed to fidelity to the spirit of the thing. The sociological tension that's very interesting to me is you could argue, and again, you could argue that the way, the Jews, the Jewish people who believed Jesus was the Messiah, that them being called Christians was a reason why it was able to spread, right? It's a reason why you end up with your Owen Barfields or C.S. Lewis or all the things that it did. But that was also what cursed it. That was also what got in the way of its ability to return to the spirit, right? This is, you know, as you know in Belonging Again, I'm very obsessed basically with the problem of spread. Looking at history, often the things that become spreadable do so through a means that put at risk the very thing that makes you want to spread it. But if you don't do it, then you don't spread, and you end up atomized, you run out of money, you're not sustainable, and it dies out, right? And you get eaten alive by burnout. Basically, burnout gets you almost always, right? So in order to spread, often it requires acknowledgement or naming of which necessarily gets in the way of the spirit. But if you don't do that, then the spirit you're trying to preserve, you run out of money, or you all die, like something happens, right? And that mega tension that is at the heart, I think, of, if people in the meta crisis are talking about conscious elevation, that tension is at the very heart of all of this. That actually, I think one of the key, though, characteristics of what has already been said, and there's more to be said, but I'll pause. You're screwed when you get to the point where if you say, I think Christianity is a failure, I think the church is no longer Christ, and then you get kicked out, right? Likewise, if you can't say the liminal web is a bad name, and I actually think there's a falsity to it, then like Mr. Pascal was, like Layman was saying, then it is actually now gone in the auto-cannibalistic direction. It is now gone in the self-effacement. The spirit of this, dare I say, social coordination has to entail the ability to deconstruct the spirit of the social coordination precisely so that the spirit stays itself. That's also really critical. Like when Derrida is talking about deconstruction, we really can say he's deconstructing language itself as a solid structure. He's saying language is not definitions. Language is more like a spirit, right? So likewise, if you ever get to the place where you can't deconstruct any name, then by definition, it loses its spirit. I think you always have to think of Derrida in terms of the releasing of spirit, not merely the cutting down, but it's deconstructing a sort of ostracized structure that you have to deconstruct to get that spirit going again, right? So you have to entail the critique within it. But the reason I bring that up is because in human history, let's put it this way, the ability of a system to entail its own critique without then othering or scapegoating the ones who do the critique has not happened, because that requires a level of consciousness elevation, voicecraft training, sitting with negativity, encountering of the real that the average person doesn't have. And so whoever brings the critique into the structure that is needed for the releasing of the spirit, because the people in there are not perhaps trained in that, then demonize that person. That person goes off and forms a new organization or a new denomination, and you never get the spirit released. It's a spurious infinity, right? This is the rub. Like we keep talking about centralization, decentralization, new community or not new community, until the community on average entails people that can handle the critique of that community within itself without alienating the people that do that, then it is inevitable the spirit that community was created in order to incubate will die. But that encounters people that can deal with the real, like the subjective destitution, Cadell, we've been talking about, like the ability to handle negativity, right? And everyone talks a big game of handling negativity. Everyone talks a big game of being open to critique and different things. But history is a long story of people saying that, having the tough conversation, and then gradually kind of drifting away. Like it's not that they necessarily ever come out and say, I don't like you. There's a lot of drifting, a lot of kind of pulling apart. And that's human freaking nature. That's what people do. When you encounter someone who has a different view of, say, well, the moral real, different ethical positions or different views of like the deepest metaphysical positions, we as human beings tend to very quickly get away from them. Because in order to not get away from them, you would have to have regular training, new habit formation as an adult with people all around the world while simultaneously paying your bills, taking care of your family, and so on and so forth. That technology has never existed. That possibility has never existed for regular adult education, habituating people to like handle negativity, really, or different modes of talking or conversations that don't land. Like Tim's saying, if a conversation has to land, then you never learn to orbit and you never learn to sit with uncomfortableness. Like one of the worst feelings is when you have an unfinished paper. I'll just speak from personal experience. When you have an unfinished paper and it's in your head and you got to go to work and you want to land it and you can't, and you got to talk about it, and then you got to read another book, like it's on your brain for 3 months. Oh yeah, it's terrible. But that actually is necessarily the denial of a landing that is necessary for you to handle negativity. The denial of landing and the handling of negativity are like this. They're like this. Now, that doesn't mean landing is bad. That doesn't mean finishing is bad. It's when it becomes an idol, when you make it a religious thing, when you make it an ultimate good that if you don't do it, it's bad. Well, guess what? By definition, the people you'll land more with are the ones who think like you. The people who think and talk like you are the ones that you'll land with more. So you will tribalize and global pluralism goes down the tube. So it's really important to be habituated and trained into a life of orbiting regularly as an adult from any geographical location on planet Earth when you have 30 minutes between finishing tax papers sitting over there, right? And that new form of habituation and habitus, as many of the sociologists will say, is central for any hope, any freaking hope of having communities that can entail their own critique to keep the spirit of it alive before it ostracized into some label that then is eaten by entropy. So I think that coordination of new habit formation is really, really important. And I appreciate what people have been saying.
Layman?
I could go, but I'd love to hear you say something, Jacob.
Well, thank you. I'm just thinking, even maybe the approach to the question was wrong in a certain sense, because it was like, what is the liminal web as external objective thing? And maybe much more useful would have simply been, what is the liminal web for you? Because that just like, as I've been going through this conversation, that's becoming like, oh, that's much more obvious and much more easily communicable. And the reality for me is that I have been in several different countries in the last 3 years. I've been continuously in question of sense of place. And the liminal web has been an indispensable support infrastructure. And it's created this completely, as you say, historically novel situation where I can have a continuity of connection with a field or a mesh of fields whilst being in altogether different places. It's been a place that has continually like reminded me of the value and importance of the things that I find purposeful and that I'm called to during the periods of time when that becomes less clarified. And so I've been tuned up, and it's been a harmonic space for me to come and tune up and come out and be reclarified. And I think one of the characteristics of people who are drawn to this resource and drawn to supporting it is that they are carrying things or called to things which have no obvious point of landing. Like literally no obvious point of landing. So that's something that I've made progress on to some degrees, others in the space more so, but it's still it's felt a very difficult question for me as to how to really, really land what is going on for me in the digital sphere into the local sphere, and if even those do land, or it's just kind of like two connected realities, my life in Oaxaca and my life in the liminal web, and who I am in those is quite different. But I've had an abiding experience of finding people in the liminal web with whom I feel more seen than I do outside of the liminal web in the various local contexts that I've moved through. And that's just a huge, huge gift, period. And I wrote a piece on my Culture Pilgrim Substack a few days ago called Healing the Unhealable. And I wrote about a really deep, intense process that was going on in me around digesting material that I had read in a book called Ordinary Men several years ago. And I had been drawing on all different sources, and I came through to the net like a week or two ago, and I spoke with Daniel about where I was at with the whole process and all the pieces, and I was able to kind of put them through the net, have them filtered through the net, and then filtered back to me in a way that just like the pieces reorganized within my internal architecture, and like things that couldn't quite fit became fitted. And then it was like the tension that I was holding, which was pretty intense, was dissolved. And I was able to sort of heal that and move on from it. So, it's of immense practical value to self-realization and healing. And I think the potential of that we're only just beginning to tap into. There's a lot more that can be done in less strictly dialogical kinds of spaces as well.
Yeah, I lived for a while in Buddhist communities, so there's this famous, the Buddha Sangha and the Dharma kind of idea. So there's the knowledge set for wisdom, and then there's real and or imaginal figures with which you enter into some kind of transformative relationship, but then there's a community aspect to it as well. And so, if we're going to do this, if we're going to have Holy Spirit circulating in some coherent way in a bioinformational planetary network civilization, what kind of community do we need to be able to cultivate and emerge around that? And I think that's a lot of what the liminal web is templating for people, right? And the ones who get it, the ones who find it, the ones who stay definitely have that sense of a mutual recognition. I think there's a sense that we all put a premium on, to one degree or another, the ability to actually live in between different values and perspectives and energies and tensions, right? It's not just about a multi-perspectival model of reality. It's, can you bear the cognitive dissonance, the emotional dissonance between these different aspects of yourself to the point where your presence in that ambiguity allows for that alignment? And is there a community of people who've also had experience like that and can support that and stand for that? So that's a huge piece of this for me. I think another piece of this is, the voice craft thing. How do we develop these skills? We're not just showing up for a four-way Zoom cast. We're demonstrating and practicing a certain set of quality enhancing skills that we would all like to be better at going forward, and in which we see some kind of redemptive or even soteriological opportunity going forward. Um, all of that mixed with, you know, your real families and in-person events and all those sorts of things, and the ability to I mean, one of the most amazing things for me is when there's a huge potential network of people accessible in this digital space. And within that, there's a smaller set of people who you really vibe with, and then a smaller set of those who you can form actual relationships and engagements with. And that's a really important task, right? There's a sacred task in forming high trust subnetworks within all of this. And one of the things we've seen over the last 100 years of intentional communities and alt social experiments of various kinds is people rushing into this idea that, okay, we're all just going to be open, or we're all just going to be on the same page. And that's not adequate. You have to carefully and slowly form your actual organic trust based relationships with people. And it's not everyone equally in this space, and yet most of the people in this space really cut down the distance. Like OG was saying at the beginning, the introduction problem is solved in a certain way, right? You can jump right in, and by jumping right in, you have a much more rapid way of starting to figure out who you actually want to talk to and who you actually relate to, and how that starts to unfold in the world. Um, the other thing I would want to just bring up is, I think there's a really important purpose to function for ongoing, unique variants of the Zoom discourse, right, and of the podcast space. So we did the Meta Modern Christmas special, and we did the liminal comedy roast of Alexander Bard. In 2 weeks, we're doing the comedy roast of Jim Rutt, right? We just had the integral stage and Cadell Last Philosophy Portal crossover. There's a lot of creative space for unique experimental events using the same kind of media. And I think that's an additional aspect of all of this stuff, how it relates to your personal life, how you form new communities and new relationships, how we instantiate this in our actual practices and lived experience and not just the idea sets. I think there really is a way in which we're a kind of vanguard of the network society, as long as we continue to experimentally produce novel variants and conjunctions of what these sorts of discussions can be.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, on that last point, there's a time energy factor there, which is really big. And that would be it's the main barrier for me. Definitely have plans to collaborate with Cadell, for instance, on a month of Philosophy Portal later in the year. I'm open to so many things. this is, so there's a part of my, like, so that the most alive thing in me in response to your flow takes us into a conversation that doesn't quite fit within this recording for the sake of that. So like, I'm basically saying yes to that. There's people entering my mind who I know, that those people have mentioned, like Adriana, she's always mentioned, I know Layman, I'm, good friends with his partner, and we're thinking of, so there's stuff where it's like, yeah, there's some conversations to be had. I apologize, listeners, for that last 30 seconds of complete irrelevance, but you know what I mean? There we are. So yeah, totally down for that. I think one thing I want to add in the cognitive dissonance piece, there was something I wanted to respond to, Jacob, you about, in terms of the value you find in the liminal web as a retuning, and then questions around whether that can land in the local context. I kind of just want to share from that perspective, from my own journey, is that, I feel very confident that it will for you. And the more you build on your dedication, the more you will attract and build relationships that are in continuity with that to some degree. I mentioned cognitive dissonance. It was something that Layman mentioned in terms of how much you can handle the cognitive dissonance of perhaps being in one space, if I'm hearing you correctly, being in one space where maybe only a fraction of the attitude or perspective is readily part of the discourse or is available ostensibly to people's perception, as you might also inhabit other contexts, and there might be a transperspectival context that you also get to play in, and people, and of course this is something that I imagine all experience, and certainly experience every time you even speak to a child, for instance, right? Like any family member. And there is a sense in which I can relate to the struggle of an identity to reckon with the cognitive dissonance they experience at the apparent incommensurability of these things. Certainly I can feel the struggle of that at various points in my life. It's just not welcome to speak that thing here, but I feel if I can't speak that thing, then I'm actually not giving you what I need to give you in order to form a relationship with me. And that doesn't really even seem like the kind of thing I want to be in dissonance about, because if I'm in dissonance about that, am I cutting myself off from part of myself that I actually need to be in order to build a relationship? And so there's a real, I find there to be a real helpful utility in that term. I also find that a way of naming a kind of a movement in the resolution of that, which isn't to say final resolution, but a movement in the resolution of that, like recognizes, of course, the beauty in another's expression, the beauty in another's presentation, beauty as such, right? But just, it's always there. Like for me, there's no like, when I'm well, and I don't relate to that as necessarily, in the one hand, it's handling the cognitive dissonance, but in another hand, it's just being a continuity. And without that, dissonance is a very interesting notion. I actually would love to port the conversation a totally different direction here if we were just round of fire and whatever else, because it's part of Bernardo Kastrup's core framing of how he relates to his analytic idealism system. And over a number of years, I mean, I haven't, I've obviously checked in every number of years with his perspective, and I find in general, I've always felt intuitively dissonance to be a really insufficient way of demarcating difference between the one and the many. It's almost like it's like, for me, it's partly affectively colored poetically by a psychological literature where, dissonance and maybe dissociation and these types of things are kind of like defense mechanisms that have adaptive value for a time, but in a sense are always short-term solutions. I wouldn't necessarily want to go about framing the cultivation of personality as such, as just like ever more individuated dissonance from the multiplicity and the whole. And for a similar reason, I make a similar kind of poetic critique about the usage of negation as a term in metaphysics that want to speak about transformation in a way that involves the subject in the ontology. There's like a glass half full turn of that, which is to say the affirmation, the remembering of the immanence through the transcendence. And in that sense, there's no way I aspire to a life that just gets better at holding cognitive dissonance, even though to some degree that's necessary. And when I experience it, it's kind of there's a functional value to it. But I can aspire to a life that can come increasingly more to appreciate the beauty in those around me and those I'm in relation with, and see through that and reground in relationship, right, where we are and who we are. And all of a sudden then we are constellating an addition and a transformation to the liminal web. So there we go. And yeah, I'm down to stay a little bit too. Maybe just another 20 or so for me.
Yeah. This is becoming such a psychologically rich exploration, Tim. I appreciate this inclusion of dissonance. It makes me think that I need to do a month of dissonance in the Resonant Man initiative to there's a lot there to be included. And I do think it's very interesting how a certain right amount of dissonance can be the salt in the pot, and it can be actually the basis of like a bit of dissonance can be the basis of connection, between a man and a woman, I think sometimes especially. And then there's another way of dissonance where it's just like, oh yeah, no, that is just becoming the mechanism that's preventing the possibility of resonance. So there's kind of like a dissonance that is held in the possibility of resonance that is very spicy and far more interesting in some respects than simply a smooth glide into resonant harmonious discourse. And I just want to receive your words of encouragement. It means a lot. And I have some positive news on that front, actually. I've got 2 paid opportunities this summer in the UK giving workshops, one of them at the Realization Festival. So yeah, some big phase shifts occurring on that front. And to think about those kinds of opportunities manifesting even a year ago or 2 years ago, it seems very, very far out indeed. So that's very encouraging. But in many respects, I think I've been called to and chosen a place that is both a lot easier for me to show up as me, as a liminal kind of person, and also it's very difficult because I've chosen a culture that speaks in Spanish. And in certain respects, like the environment that I've chosen to go into is one that kind of like hits on all of the earlier developmental levels that I probably missed between 13 and 18 or something, that need to be kind of like addressed. And so it's like the possibility of going to some liminally open conference somewhere in the world and giving a workshop is like, feels super aligned, and I'm ready to jump in, and the Liminal Web has been like a top tier training ground. Everything I've done in the Dialogo space has been incredible training that can now be taken forth into contexts that are not explicitly liminal, don't have explicit connection with the Liminal Web, but find it that there's a value there that they can connect with. And that has to do with really creating space really orienting towards resonance, really creating the possibility for a sense of the sacred to be felt in a non-ideologically constricted context. And yet, the idea of like going out and putting up posters in Oaxaca and saying, I'm going to do a philosophy gathering and just see who shows up, like that for me is mega, like exposing. And it, like all of the things of like, oh, anybody shows up and like those kinds of things. So, all of which is just a reminder of the deep work that really earnestly participating in this kind of wisdom path requires, and the courage to actually enact the things that we talk about. And ultimately this can be a kind of space that resonates that back and kind of gives you the clarified energy within yourself to go out and do that. But ultimately there's still a sort of heroic going out and doing that as well. And although I wouldn't posit that in the context of going out alone, I would understand myself to be supported in that as well.
Absolutely. A lot has been said, has been very well put. So first off, when you made the point, Jacob, that the liminal web doesn't know where it's going to land, doesn't know where all of this is going. And I know also you've emphasized healing. What's very interesting is the liminal web for me, and I think that's a great way to reframe the question. This space actually does have a lot to do with healing. Actually, there is something about these kind of conversations that having a healing effect on the human being that is more primary than landing. And here's the funny thing. Actually, to truly heal, you have to not make your intention landing. Because one of the reasons you're hurt is because by your own good ideas, you landed somewhere and it didn't go so well. One of the things that actually is why people need healing is their effort to land, to have a good career, to have a good idea, to have good relationships. Their good ideas that brought them to a place of landing is why precisely they got traumatized. And actually what they need to do is forego the idol of knowing where things are going to go, precisely so they can be healed by something other than their own power, right? Like we talked about the Holy Spirit, the idea of that is only the Spirit can heal you. Well, you have to deny your own power to do it. And one of the things that happens critically is that can sound like a very vague religious idea, but in a conversation like this, you literally forget yourself. Or even in doing the liminal web, you literally don't know what the point is. You are practically doing things that are not landing, even if you don't consciously realize you're doing that, thus setting yourself up in the place to have things occur within you and to you that are beyond the horizon of your own understanding, which is always where healing is found. You know, something that, Tim, we've talked about at Voicecraft, it's how Voicecraft is trying to habituate a person into speaking in a manner that is sort of orbiting a kind of mystery, not landing on the mystery, but learning how to find that depth that is within people, that is from which words come, that is lost in words, and yet words are orbiting it. The image I have is like walking around the crater of an asteroid. The asteroid is not there, but in walking around it, you can get an idea of its size, its impact, and what it was like in the kind of apathetic, that the crater is not the asteroid, but the act of walking around it gives you real knowledge about the asteroid, but it's humble. And this kind of act of speaking, that is also what you learn to do with other people who, especially if they're different, because if you're too bent on your idea of how things would go, you actually squash everything. That sort of activity and learning how to speak to that, and also how to find resonance, as you've talked about, Jacob, like that is all actually this kind of work of healing. And I would also associate healing. The other thing that's really important to say with the liminal web, in my opinion, is healing is somehow connected with friendship. The ability to form friends and the ability to be healed is really strongly and mysteriously connected. And we live in an age where nobody has friends. We have a friend session. Older, especially adults, do not have friends. It is a real tragedy and is a real problem. But one of the reasons actually people don't have friends, so this is the funny thing, like Tim was saying, there's something about time energy that makes it difficult to do the liminal web, if you will, or to do spaces like this. But actually one of the reasons people don't have friends is because of time energy. Because they don't know when they're going to have friends. And if they do have friends, it tends to be from people at work or say people at church. But then you have a random dice throw of different personalities, consciousness, and interests. And eventually what happens to most adults is eventually you get hurt, or you hurt them on accident, and you have a lot to do. And then you're like, why do I bother? And so people withdraw and they stop having friends and they stop having community. They may go through the motions of it, but they actually end up in not having the right skills. They can't maintain it, right? Also, critically, a very important thing is when you're doing stuff like spaces where there's synth space and integral theory and voicecraft, everyone here is doing their own thing. So if I fall off the face of the world for 2 weeks or 2 months because of having a child or something, I can come back and know that everyone's still doing their thing. And actually, that's really comforting, because as I get through the loss of time, energy, and they're just like, wow, this is still happening, and I don't have to maintain it. Because another reason people move out of friendships is because they become freaking stressful. I'm sorry I haven't called you in 2 weeks. I just haven't had time, and you feel guilty, and then they're mad at you, and they're just kind of actually almost kind of parasitically depending on you, and there's like attachment problems, and that makes it like, forget it. Relationships are too difficult. I'll just have my family, but I'm not going to have community. And so gradually, especially under the pressure of costs, bills, and all stuff, people don't have friends, right? They don't have those communities. But here's the problem. Literally, if you do not have friends, you do not heal, and especially, but then here's the problem. Like, not only do people don't have friends, if they do have friends, they think like them. So then it's tribalistic. It's not multifaceted. You get self-symmetry, right? And you get all these different problems, right? So you have a friendship problem that is tied to a time-energy problem that the social coordination mechanism helps make possible, precisely because people are doing their own thing, and they're also crossing with one another, and they're also all mutually put together for, we are here for something that is beyond us. So my identity is not tied to how many times you're willing to call me or how many times you speak to me, because then what ends up happening is most friendships become basically guilt-based or quantity-based, or did you call me enough, and all of these things that adults eventually go, it's just another job. It's just another freaking job. I can't do it. And they don't do it. And all the data shows they don't do it. And people basically are just calling the friends the people they work with, but then they retire and those people are gone. And it's a really sad thing. And then elderly people are alone. So this is a major, major problem. And the social coordination mechanism can help step in for that. But it comes with the other time energy problem, to use David McCarriker's language, of the economic realities, right? And how those things occur. But also, please note, because that opens a lot, another thing to look at about this, if we see all of this as some sort of spirit that is in development or unfolding, another way to think about what has happened is we exist in an age where the speed of capital, to use Benjamin Studebaker's language, is super freaking fast, and we need a way for the speed of spirit to likewise be fast. The development of personal relationships. Well, ladies and gentlemen, the social coordination mechanism allows for a certain acceleration and development of spirit between people that can actually dialectically work alongside the speed of capital. And if you don't have something of the development of spirit, to use maybe in the Koratani sense or just the human sense, to actually work with that, then you will be effaced by the logic of capital that ultimately leads you into a commodification that I think Mikey Downs is correct, leads to Nick Land, basically. And so the acceleration of spirit is really important, but the acceleration of spirit is precisely in the realm of things like negativity, participation, friendship, voicecraft, and developing certain capacities that allow you to actually move your own development in a manner that is not simply reduced to the logic of, say, to the logic of commodity, of instrumentalization. I think also, too, on the points that were brought up with negation and dissonance, whenever there's instruments, there's the possibility of dissonance. You know, if there are two instruments, there can be dissonance. But the dissonance is a testament to the possibility of music. It's not really the dissonant itself is the enemy. The dissonance is an enemy in so much as you think that it doesn't contain within it the material for music, right? But when you go, actually, there's dissonance here because there's possibility of a deeper harmony. Oh, I don't want to get rid of the dissonance. I just want to play the notes at a different time and figure out how to order them, right? So one of the things that can happen is if you travel a lot, you're like, how does all the parts of the different places I lived go together, right? And there's a way with the social coordination mechanism, you could say, oh, there's a thread running between them that then makes it as if they all play the music together, right? Because now I have a way to coordinate them within the same song, right? And so there's a way in which what you do is the dissonance. Well, this is the point. The dissonance, too, following Philip Reef and all these other cats, when you have pluralism, people undergo existential anxiety because they realize they could have been born different, and then all of their beliefs don't have authority, and they undergo psychosis or things like that, right? Well, you need to figure out how to actually work with difference and have it not overwhelm you. Well, you need a coordination mechanism and a regular habitus by which to work with people to turn that dissonance into music, right? But the key is most people interpret dissonance in the Philip Reeve sense or the Peter Berger as evidence that the world has gone to heck, that something went wrong. So we need to go backwards. So they view dissonance as something to run from. And, you know, what I hear Tim saying, and I agree with, is that no, dissonance is actually evidence of there being the material that makes music possible there, if one actually learns to approach it correctly. But ironically, the very need to land can actually get in the way of figuring out how to make music with that dissonance, because you stop the improvisation, you stop the working the pieces together to find the song, and you come into it with your own idea, fitting it together, and then dissonance just stays the dissonance because you're not really letting the instruments give you the music, you're imposing it top down. And then to me, that also speaks to, if one talks of negation, for me, negation always has to be negation sublation, because negation without sublation, which is affirmative, ultimately is effacement. Like negation that is not at the same time sublation is actually self-effacement, right? And so negation of dissonance is music, but that negation of dissonance is only possible because of the dissonance. Therefore, the dissonance entails its own affirmation within itself once you negate it. That's kind of the trick move, is negation, when properly used, becomes an affirmation, like a negation of the negation per se. And one of the reasons why, though, like, human beings, like, we often have to, in a sense, die to self, die to our need to land, die to our need to know where we're going, die to our preset ideas precisely to have that affirmation. That's why there's a kind of negation. But in a weird way, the things you negate were things that were actually holding back the affirmation. So in a way, it's not a negation, it's an unleashing of the music that's behind it. That's the weird thing that occurs, right? The highest dimensional emotional experience always have this weird doubleness going on. Love, the person you love, is the one who can hurt you the most. The thing you're passionate about is that of which you suffer for. Beauty pierces. Higher dimensional experience is always one with its negative, right? And most of our language for emotion and reality is algebraic. It's 2 1-to-1. Good, bad. Really, the higher dimensional experiences entail their own pain. But that pain is also the coordinating mechanism to better approach the affirmation, right? And it's, but what is that? That's facing a freaking negativity and learning to habituate yourself toward it. And that's the kind of work that for me is being pointed to. And then all of that, and I'll close, is to me also the evidence of the proper relationship with the dissonance is found in that moment of self-forgetfulness, where you forget yourself. And again, for me, when I think of the liminal web, I think about running, Michelle and I were part of running Unoya, an art gallery venue and performance place for 8 years. And we had open mics and we had these dinners every Thursday where people got together and we, sit on the porch, Big T, Mr. Dillard. Those particular experiences, like Layman was saying, of people gathering together who have a certain quality of being that when they come together, it's just straight magic. And much of your life, you go, that's it. That's good. There's something in that is really important. The problem is as you get older, and most people will say this, the best years of my life were in college. Oh yeah, back then, but then I get a job. Then I went into the what? The real world. Dun, dun, dun. How many people speak of the real world as basically when everything started to suck? Most people. I would make the claim that one of the reasons that occurs is because in the real world, the ability to coordinate experiences like the Eunoia magic or the self-forgetful flow is really freaking hard. And maybe people get it a little bit on their 40th birthday. The social coordination mechanism makes it possible to actually, in the real world, continue and extend and coordinate those kind of experiences like Eunoia throughout all the days of your life. And if you do not have that, you cannot heal, you cannot be fully human, and you will inevitably be trained into the logic of commodification or quantity or that of which lowers your consciousness to a place where you may get out of bed in the morning, but you don't wake up. And so it is so important now to have the technology to coordinate those experiences that are so critical to the human spirit beyond 25 years old into the mid years and into the older years, Or else we will not have adults that will be having children that will be raised in the right way. The children will be traumatized. You won't have eldership. You won't have communities that cross-generalize. And you won't have people able to deal with difference in a manner that does not lead to political suicide. And so for me, I view the social coordination problem as, and then I'll close, as a way to address the problem of extending those moments of life into your entire life. Because for most people, they end after they enter the real world.
Hallelujah.
Yeah. Amen. Amen. Thank you, Daniel. Beautifully put. I'll pass it to
I
Layman.
really appreciate the invocation of friendship. I think friendship and inner practice provide the context for healing in a lot of significant respects, and not just the not just the context in which we heal, but the context in which we become a being who's capable of navigating toward healing. Like there's a big decision about like, are we such things as can actually figure out what would heal us? So there's something for us to grow. There's some kind of interbeing in ourselves to substantiate and manifest such that it can do the steering. And that both friendship and inner praxis are opportunities for that being to grow so that we can put our trust in it to make decisions about what might heal us in a way that exceeds our ability to calculate. Um, Tim, um, I really appreciate your sensitivity around dissonance and the negative, right? They obviously play a huge role, but the way we think about them and the way we name them is a little bit clumsy. Where does dissonance pass into resonance? Where is the separator, the connector? Are there different ways to language this and different ways to feel about it that don't um, create such a clunky use of the notion of the negative, even if we think about the negation of negation becoming an affirmation? Is there a richer, more organic way to do that? And Jacob, um, we're glad you're here, endlessly not landing with us. I'm excited to have you come on the integral stage. I think there is something here in whatever we're terming liminal that is a gamble in the Alain Badiou sense of what makes you a subject is taking a risk on something that might be a truth, right? And this is a cool thing to take a gamble on, and taking this gamble brings a subjectivity forward, intensifies a subjectivity in us. And I know that it's an exciting and a gross thing to put up posters for your philosophy event in Oaxaca. But the thing I always felt is if you feel like you made a really cool poster, that takes that problem away. Like if you look at it, you're like, I don't care if anybody comes, that's a fucking awesome poster, then you're set.
I agree.
Yeah, I got to take off. Love you guys. Looking forward to having more time with each of you.
You're
Thank
beautiful,
you,
Layman
Layman.
Pascal.
Great having you. Well, I'll just maybe take a few extra minutes here since so we can close out. But yeah, I think what comes through there, Daniel, is a sense of like you need to see that it's possible. You need to see something's possible. Well, actually, the Christians would say the best faith is when you haven't seen it's possible. But setting that aside, you do need to see something's possible somewhere in some minute context. And the liminal web, or really any variety of like medicine spaces, can be somewhere where something becomes possible that is not possible elsewhere, e.g., healing of things that seem unhealable, dissonances transforming into resonances, ambiguities stewing endlessly, seemingly, until suddenly like bursting forth into elegant, harmonious self-organization. And I say like those three are all like, if you were looking for kind of a cookbook of what is necessary to address and meet our time with hope, and actually a degree of like enthusiasm or bravado, or just like a strong positive energy, it's through like having a felt sense that those three things are all possible. Yeah.
Yeah, well, for me, I feel like I've got a whole day's energy ahead of me, which could comment on any number of things that we've touched on in this conversation. There's lots that's come up for me in this. I don't think I don't think I need to add anything else. Hmm. Yeah, I will say that there's something about how you one of the things you invoked was the trickster or the fool at the beginning of this. And that's often an interesting thing for me to find space for or share in myself in these particular formats. It's not something I feel disconnected from in other contexts. I think probably one of the reasons why it almost comes through for me a little bit more naturally in other contexts, perhaps ones that follow on from contexts like this, is because the context of friendship we're sharing in here, well, is, my presentation for this is for this, and it has only happened rarely. There have been many misperceptions, but it's relatively rare that I'll meet someone who's interactive, who's first come into touch with me online, who then brings a very strong, constraining projection into the relation itself. That is fairly rare, but one of the ways that I would naturally respond to that is probably almost immediately play a bit of the fool to dispel some of those projections, which might be expecting a certain kind of relationality from me, maybe even as a friend. I'm a pretty friendly guy, so the friendliness isn't so much it, but friend in some more subliminal, like one of the reasons I'm even agreed to this conversation is because Jacob, you've been kicking around for years and we've been having conversations for years,
Yeah.
right? And same obviously with OG, many hundreds of hours of conversation, and Layman to a lesser extent, but still over a number of years. Otherwise, this topic for me, it's like this topic is a very deep portal for me that I would also never, I don't have any desire to be even that central for me. And yet, in certain ways, part of my self narrative, and again, just part of it, particularly in these contexts, projects it into reality as well. So as much as I've been one of the ones here going like, about this liminal web thing, kind of whatever, not really care about the terminology, I'm gonna do my own thing regardless because I care about you guys and what we're doing. There's a sense in which I'm contributing to making it real through the strength of my own projection regarding what it's not in some important sense. And the subtlety of relating with all of that and still feeling as though I am actually developing a relationship in the sense of just from one angle that I am actually being known in this context and not so totally misunderstood that the projection of what this relation isn't one that I'm actually skin in the game, in with is massive. And so that's the private and the public thing again. And like, so, part of the not landing or the confusion or however that type of phenomenology is known, part of that in its own way maybe is the fool coming through. It's a little bit of like, well, I'm not quite saying that thing. I'm maybe saying this thing. Maybe it's this thing. Actually, if we were in relationship, we could know with a richness that wouldn't feel so diffuse. like that we actually can land this together today. I never have the experience really of not landing a conversation or anything else, right? For me, when there's a more or less clarified sense of, is this in some form a conversation that will continue, however diffusely, or is this conversation not one that will continue? I don't mean this topic exactly, right? But the onwards movement of understanding and conversation we're participating in, I have a sense of if there's mutual desire to return again, even if that was by happenstance, that we would enjoy that happenstance. And then sometimes you can get the sense that actually, maybe not, that maybe actually the dissociation might be an adaptive response to the amount of dissonance we've experienced here in the short term. Maybe we do just need to put each other out, but you know, that would always seem a little bit less like a immediate success. Maybe the work then would become, in that case, well, I got to return to metabolizing in good company with friends, or in other words, integration, right? And that maybe needs its own protected space, not yet ready perhaps, or we don't feel it would be mutually valuable immediately to step back into sharing space, right? From the holding to the sharing, opening back up into the possibility for knowing together how the dissonance we're experiencing could in fact contribute to that deeper resonance in some sense. Because sometimes that means recognizing that the particular song we wanted to play maybe wasn't the one that was like maybe as healing perhaps as it could be, as connective as it could be, you know, even perhaps for our stated aims. And so anyway, yeah, like through all of this is kind of like open to relation, and at the same time it's almost like no matter how much, it's almost like there's this, you know, one can certainly overindulge, but if you're with the pulse that is playing with that possibility of overindulging, then in a sense like it's all good, because you know, this signaling, like this invitation to tune in to any of those who are listening who might want to step a little bit more in that direction or this direction, or any of the permutations that might have been sparked from this, some which are held open in invitation. The majority of sparks in this are maybe missed in what we can actually recognize and hold open to stay in relationship to. How many connections? Daniel could probably write 15 papers from this one conversation. He might only write 5. Most of us write half of one. So, I mean, well done, you know. But like, but there's so much, and there's a sense, I think, the feeling of whether a little bit more in that direction, that particular breadcrumb does lead, hopefully not to a house with people dressed up in costumes that they're not, where they'll eat you, but instead to a lovely bakery where we can... No, there's just no way to fit that really, is there? Because bakeries often lots of calories, very little nutrition. We kind of mean the opposite, actually. Lots of nutrition, regular amount of calories. So I'm done.
I'd love to respond to that, but fear not, Daniel. I have time for another guitar solo after. I appreciate everything you just offered, and especially your kind of willingness to express, I guess, a kind of like exhaustion with conversations that feel like they're kind of trying to be about the thing or a thing rather than fundamentally about the relationality itself. And I resonate with that. And I think in this context, bringing the four of us together is far, far more significant and meaning bearing than the question at hand. And I think we've just scratched the surface. I think there's kind of a yearning, which may not be afforded by my current cognitive capacity, possibly when I'm in a more healthy state, in a future reunion, that this can further sort of crack open and go really beyond the conventional, and I agree could be quite tiring, parameters of what this conversation actually is. And I think that, in a sense, would be the most radical thing, is for like the very notion of what the thing is to be cracked open and revealed to be something far more mysterious and interesting. And I feel that the liminal web, for all of its wishy-washiness and lack of definition, precisely bears out that possibility. And that's been demonstrated for me in the fact that I wasn't all that hyped on it. I've seen Joe Lightfoot's article. I've seen these different things go around. I've seen people put together lists of who's in the web and who's not. And when I see those lists, I have a weird like aversion where I just don't even want to like try. I don't want to be on the inside. Like I don't.
Yeah.
It's like, I don't know, maybe there's a childish part and it's like, well, I haven't been recognized, but I'm not going to try and be recognized either. So it's something of that flavor too. But Daniel has shown me that this is something that can be taken and run with and opened up. And if we can do that with the liminal web, then we can also do that with other things that appear to be kind of dead constructs, and to like mobilize them and reanimate them in a way that actually serves life. Yeah.
No, I not to jump in, I think that was beautifully put. There's a again, I've mentioned the phrase social coordination so much. There's a way in which it's a kind of apathetic social coordination, where the relation is sort of primary, and you're trying to circle some sort of thing that, like when you're trying to just have genuine fidelity to that undefinable space where things can come forth, that the presence of it is there when you gather with people who have been there long term, and thus there's been a pruning of people that are not in there for the right reasons. There are possibilities that come out of that apathetic, I use the term river hole from Cadell's System and Subjects. You have Guy Senstadt talking about the nihilism of Rosen. There are the kind of the beauty that Jockin will talk about. You'll have Sendler talking about the spacing, voicecraft, the bringing of the mystery. We've talked about the phenomenology of voice. There was some idea that when you put relation first, and you're in there for the relation first, there is some sort of pregnancy, there's some sort of womb, actually, basically, that is there, that if you stay true to the relationship and just being there for it, things come out of that are not predictable, and yet it is the whole reason we bother to predict and try to do anything at all, actually. And I would make a very extensive argument that apathetic river hole and all efforts of social coordination in history that have happened upon it have actually been behind all major civilizational paradigm formations, economics, creation of demand. Basically, when they talk about the Nordic secret, it is basically a communal effort that's making that forth. And I would say that the solo residual in economics is basically the Nordic secret, ergo the apathetic social coordination that Tim Adalin has in Voicecraft made central to his efforts and his thinking. And I also see that in your work, Jacob Kishere. And I think what Tim was saying is the only reason you're here is because, we know each other. That is the secret. Because something really important, most specialized conversations have always ended up in rational impasses, because the reason the academics were there for the specialized content is because they were invested in it libidinally, or it was their specialty, so they weren't able to critique it. And if they did critique it, they had to do it within the games of the academic conference or people, so you didn't offend anyone. Here, you can just straight out say, I don't like liminal web. And we're like, yeah, there are problems with it, isn't it? That's how you avoid all specialized conversations in history have basically been doomed to Nash equilibria or ineffective discussion because of the institutional and personal interests of the people. Because if you specialized in, say, economics or the liminal web, and that was your specialty, and you are a professor at Princeton talking about that, and you've written a lot of papers, and you go to a conference, you're not going to be able to seriously handle somebody saying, I don't really think much of it and don't like it. You may say, yeah, we're here for critique. They're not. They make their paycheck from it. Their career is in it, right? But when you're actually there primarily for the friendship, you can talk about subjects and actually get around conversational dynamics that destroy the advancement of the unfolding of possibility and thought because the topic is not primary. The key, like this is the dynamic. You need a topic like the liminal web so that you have something to cut. Like you need the topic to gather people because you need a signal. It's like, okay, we have an idea, but under that umbrella, you actually have the ability to negate in an affirmation of the relationships. Here's kind of the key. Negation, if it's properly understood, is an affirmation of the primary thing, and the primary thing in discussion is the frickin' relation, right? But the way that specialized conversations have always gone in history is that people have not seriously been able to do that because of their collective, institutional, or career investment in the topic that have thus made them end up in stagnated discussion where then the spirit is lost. The spirit is always lost, right? Like if you're in the church, for example, for Christ, and people's like, I don't know about this Christianity thing. Yeah, I don't know about it either. Yeah, I'm not sure if Christ would be about that. Well, guess what? That's when the Holy Spirit shows up being like, I don't know. Like the best philosophers tend to talk about how bad philosophy is. They'll be like, I don't know about philosophy. It seems like a waste of time. Yeah, I don't know either, right? Then boom, the spirit of philosophy comes alive, right? Or when you start going, I don't even know about this content creation stuff. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know about it either. Boom, then you have the dynamic that's interacting, right? But basically, the social coordination mechanisms throughout all of history that have brought people to places where they could even have those conversations did it through a system that created institutional and professional incentives so they could never take that break apart step that was necessary for the primary thing to emerge, which was the relationality in which the apathetic social coordination could emerge and give life to everything. So because we're here for the relationships, you don't fall into those dynamics, those conversational dynamics that trap them. We are always speaking out of spirits, and we're speaking out of spirits that are either going to bring things alive for the relationship, or dare I say principalities that end up ostracized in a rational impasse where the subject cannot move forward. And I think that's really, really important. And for me, like I agree with you, I don't like any sort of like graphic of the liminal web that says these people are in and these people are not, right? But also, I guess personally, like a reason why I force myself to use that language is precisely to put myself before the thing that I have to see and speak about that draws something negative out of me so that I'm then not just like killing the father, like Lacan and psychoanalysis say. I'm actually facing it in a manner where I actually let it work on me, face that very discomfort and negativity, so that the good that is possible within it, the dissonance that can be music, can come out. And what that is the participatory web. It is precisely the relationality that we're talking about. All of that space made possible, the suggestions of coordination that could forget itself in relationality, that if you simply don't put yourself in the negativity, like a lot of people, for example, want to say, well, we saw this, I'm spiritual but not religious, right? Well, no, you need to face the religion. You need to face the binding and the negativity, precisely so that the spirit does not just become spurious and empty, right? And so what we really
on
are...
that point briefly, what is the negativity that it's drawing out of you?
Because it becomes content creation. It just becomes about like getting clicks and careerism and who has the biggest platform and who has the biggest name. And then it does become brand making, right? But that technology has also gotten people... There are like, how many people in the liminal web started with people like a Jordan Peterson, or who, like Jim Rutt does fantastic episodes, like who have not learned a genuine amount from from Rebel Wisdom, right? These fathers, if you will, in a psychoanalytical sense, had a very necessary role to draw people into the space and to get them interested in it and to explain the situation so that people saw a reason to get invested. So the father, per se, has a very important role. The problem, of course, is that the father has to move into actually then the children and sustain the children. And of course, psychoanalytically or in any Dostoevsky novel, the children tend to get left behind or forgotten. And then they're just trying to like survive. And the father has moved on and said, oh yeah, but I have a successful platform, so I don't really care if you're trying to do the next phase, right? Like what psychoanalytically occurs is the father starts the possibility, and then the children see the kernel of the heart in that possibility, and they try to have fidelity to that, and they look to the father, and it's like, hey, can you support us or help us continue in that effort? And the father's like, no, that actually would hurt my reputation. I'm being very successful as this authoritative figure. I don't want to risk it. So that dynamic that tends to occur when you have social movements that psychoanalysis describes so well. And of course, the only way to get Holy Spirit is in a proper relationship where the Father dies for the Son and the Son dies for the Father. And Cadell has been talking about that in Christian atheism. But it's basically, yes, that's exactly right. That's like in Dostoevsky novels. And so what ends up happening is, you could say the liminal web is the father. The very success of the father then creates children that it disowns or it does not support, right? Because the father becomes successful in it, right? And that's where you're basically, in my opinion, right now at a certain crossroads. You know, I've talked about the causer, the absolute choice. You're at a certain crossroads where another reason why I talk about the liminal web is basically if the liminal web doesn't die to, I'll say, the voicecraft, die to the participatory web, and if the participatory web doesn't own the relations as primary, well, then it will self-efface. There will not be the affirmation. There will not be the negation into this possible social coordination to help us deal with making relationality central, right? So you're at a time of great decision, right? And you're at a time of great choice. And for me, one of the reasons, like you said, I like speaking with you people is one, your friends, and two, you've clearly shown through commitment that it is for the heart of the thing, not merely, and if there's any hope of this movement not solidifying into self-effacement, it must be by people who keep in mind the heart of the thing, of which necessarily comes to great cost to them, because the heart of the thing as an apophatic social coordination is hard to make intelligible to people, especially the ones who have money, who want it to be upfront and understood, right? So you have to pay a price to stay for the heart of things. It would be much easier just to give that up and do what is more understandable so you can raise capital and get your time energy back. But you know you can't do that. You know that's not the road. And what's tempting is to then try to self-deceive yourself into making yourself think it is the road when you know better, and repression and all that stuff, but you're not. You're not repressing. You're sticking to it, Tim, as are you, Jacob. You're sticking to it. And that's what it requires. But of course, it has a cost, and it's very difficult. But if nobody pays that cost, if nobody bears that weight, if nobody does that work, well, then the method dies. The movement dies. And all of the possibilities are formated by the social coordination and the liminality and these new ways of engaging with one another go by the wayside. And I believe that there's something here that matters. And I don't want to see it go by the wayside.
Awesome. Yeah, Daniel, that's fantastic. And that the psychoanalytic line of logic there is, I think, really valuable to lay out the way you did. I might have, what would it be? I might have like a slightly different way I describe my personal self-relation to the liminal web context as father, but the line of logic that still runs through that is important. Yeah, I mean, there's one thing I will just say is that I've had a variant of that conversation that really does go back about at least 5 years now, in terms of, the next thing and participation and these types of things. And maybe a few people who have made it to the end of this, I may have had those conversations with, and that is, I'm mentioning that almost like as it's like a historical point of note, because I also could believe we could have the same conversation in 5 years' time as well. And so partly for that reason, I really do identify what I'm involved in building and the people I'm collaborating with and the various kinds of opportunities and relations in my life. They really do live somewhere other than they're not just beholden to the story of the liminal web and whether or not, as we could clothe it in history, particular contexts or figures do in fact play an important role in enabling a next generation. There is a sense in which this is kind of serving as a symbolic way of particularizing universal patterns, but actually the particular contexts of our lives are not beholden to that named context in that universal position. And so there's a certain lightness with which I relate to all of this, that also I don't want to be lost, hopefully by too many people, because for all that has been said here, that is speaking with sincerity, and it is in that sense serious in terms of, you know, the history we've been a part of and what we can name and label. There's a real lightness where I don't feel that context to be bearing the weight of my life or these relationships. It could for sure play a really relevant role in shaping certain possibilities. And I won't go so far as to say I couldn't be hurt again. like, but that's also kind of, it is, as you've articulated, sort of par for the course, in terms of how the oppositional relation of profound experiences, in a sense, kind of present as together, like the relation between, you know, suffering and joy, and tears and joy, and these sorts of things, both in a way can be evocative of the profound significance and glory and ultimacy. There's one image that's been with me, which is kind of one of the ways that almost feels like it's appropriate to leave some of these conversations. There's part of me that pushes towards, there's something that pushes towards an idiosyncrasy of expression that on the one hand can do the opposite of audience retention on a podcast. But then I'm also feeling that come together with this kind of repetition that sometimes songs end with, you know, well, they'll just play the melody again. It just gets progressively quieter, and you can be listening to it and you're like, when's the last one? Where's the last thing I can listen to? When am I going to hear that last thing again? All right, the song's over now, but like impossibly, it's still playing off into the silence, and then it kind of stays with you. There's a certain sense in which ending this kind of conversation, you know, it's kind of like to really make clear that while there are invitations here, part of that invitation is, as would have already happened for any number of people, and to actually be okay with that as a kind of transmission. You can always retune into it, but there's a certain sense in which you get the message, you know, put down the phone, and I kind of feel like there's just this reverberation of the ending, and at any moment, like I'm actually like feeling very much just in connection with the person who tunes off right now and attends to their own life, obviously. And it's like there's an impossibility here, and I'm not trying to be naive about, you know, the reality of content, or the differences in medium of communication between this as a podcast, this being listened to, and then the actual context of communication in a listener's life, which is totally contextually different. There's obviously tremendous differences. There's like an unbridgeable gap there. But at the same time, I really am interested in the continuity of integrity of relationality as it can be translated across the mediums. And this is always something I've tried to communicate in various different ways. And that has like there's something of a joy in that for me. Like there's always, like I find it challenging when it's not bad to be challenged, obviously, but if I can spring from this into the other things I need to do today, that would be fantastic, you know. Mm-hmm. And so yeah, I don't know, man. This it's as Daniel says, with this whole, you know, podcast that's not a podcast thing. This is almost like playing that out into its own kind of infinity. and there's part of me that just can't help. I want to just play with the I'm playing with my own unlistenability. I'm actually to be that's kind of where you're more likely to find me. Do you know what I mean? Like that's closer to where we could find each other. But I'm also not open to meeting everyone, so it's kind of like whatever. Anyway, it's been great. I appreciate you all. Thank you so much. I didn't quite land a point there before I went into that like last little bit. There was somewhere in the middle, like from the ultimacy back into the there was something in there, but fuck it, whatever.
Well, I guess on that note, drawing to a close this not podcast exploration. Yeah, it's been great to spend some time with you guys, also with Layman. It was wonderful to have a first conversation with him. Yeah, I think there's a huge depth and richness and a possibility space which is of possibly existential importance to a lot of people underlying this conversation, where whilst it's almost become occult and hidden in our conversation, and other times been really blazing forwards and clear. And I appreciate our ability to hold both of those, and to really hold it, and to really see it, and to be really alive to it, and also to just let it all go and disappear into a bit of a joke. So yeah, thank you both for joining today.
Thank you, Jacob Kishere. And Tim, you're awesome. Thank you.
Thank you for letting me be a bit of a chaos agent.
Chaos is fun.
I love to bring you out of Voicecraft and see you, and I love to see you out of your den in the wild space of SenSpace.
Oh man, yeah. I think people have probably had enough of me for now. I'm very interested in playing with the. Very interested in playing with the. It's so interesting to me how incredible, because you take enough hate in terms of comments and different projections over the years online, and it's just so and of course in living a life where you put yourself out there and meet people, the experience of not being liked for not a particularly good reason. Of course there's good reason as you understand the total psychic context, but just in the sense of like, Jesus Christ, that's like 99% projection, 1% hook. Do you know what I mean? Like, fuck, I don't have the time, energy to relate with that. Go take that somewhere else. And sometimes, and the way that perception in the context of the digital and the context of attentionalism becomes part of the reality, but it becomes part of the reality downstream of a kind of an effacement on the reality, and that's a real tragedy, right? So I'm not one for being, like, there's some Kantian type of perception and then reality, and much more in terms of process for much more of the continuity. But I really do think in the digital age, the gap between perception and reality can obviously be so massive in the context of propaganda and all this stuff, right? And so I'm very interested in playing on the edge of, I'm actually really confident that I can, like, I'm going to be too basic here because I am also serious about predators and different types of parasocial dynamics and all these types of things. But I guess you could say I'm quite confident in my ability to make friends and to be friendly. And I care about people, and I generally get on with people in a context where that person also wants to develop a relationship or make friends, right? Now, doesn't mean I can be friends with everybody in that way of commitment, but nevertheless. And so I'm actually kind of interested in playing into the meme of either not being likable or misunderstood, and almost trying to like knock on the door of the perception of the framing that's influencing the perception of the unlikability. I'm not asking anybody I'm friends with already to be listening to this. Do you know what I mean? Like after a certain point, that just becomes repetition. But it's very interesting to play with the, oh, this is what you're like in that space, out of that space. I have I have no doubts about, if I connect with someone in this context, I don't feel any doubt about connecting with them in the in-person context, right? I've been through enough of that. I'm kind of playing with I want to play with the edge of the projections around. It's kind of like, don't expect too much, but also don't but still trust. It's kind of like, it's trying to actually communicate. I'm actually opening to really developing deep trust, but it is becoming increasingly challenging to do that as we open up into scaling these types of contexts. And I'm kind of almost purposefully obfuscating my own relationship to the meme of myself online, because I almost just don't have time for that as much, right? I have some time for it, but I also have trust that through relationships that are already present and ones that aren't coming in with such strong projection onto me, that actually it's really quite easy to navigate once we drop in our part of relating with each other, without trying to big that up too much too. But the obfuscation of these boundaries where they're open to intimacy and trust is there, but also not wanting to just render oneself so open that they're vulnerable. So also to detract, there's something in there which I think is I'm trying to make conscious a kind of a way of coming into awareness about navigating that movement and relationship between, let's say, attentionism into participation. Bud called that communism in the podcast I had with him. I'm like, I don't know about that, mate. Certainly disagreeing with that from some political perspective, but nevertheless, attentionism into participationism, there's the sensitivity towards how one actually opens and signals and shows up to build relationship. That would be that thing which OG is pointing to, or what is it actually to enter relation with children in some sense. Maybe that's partly where some of the fool is coming out. And maybe that's happening somewhat haphazardly, but also not to make too much of a meme of the fool as well. It's kind of like you actually have to be genuinely a little bit retarded. You know what I mean? A little bit foolish and actually kind of a little bit. So how conscious can one be about being a fool? I don't know. You actually maybe have to risk genuinely being foolish. All right, that's it. I am totally done. And thank you.
No, but what you're saying, all of those kind of experimentations, social, conversational, psychotechnologies and experimentations are what are precisely necessary to do friendship. You see, very critically, one of the reasons friendship has gone away is because people are not skilled in those technologies that you are describing. And so friendship equals just openness, which only works if the people are like you and they're in their immediacy. When you start talking about friendship across great difference, there are those kind of skills that becomes necessary. So for example, you're talking many spiritual leaders will intentionally create barriers between them and the students to make sure that the students they have are actually genuine, right? If you don't create those barriers, you actually end up destroying the entire spiritual initiative, right? There will be intentional kind of barriers that are created to have a filtration between people that are actually serious and those who are not. That's actually necessary to find the people that you in particular can be friends with. Otherwise, you get too many numbers, you can't relate, and you don't actually have signals, and you don't know reality, right? See, the problem of friendship is actually tied to the problem of knowing reality as well, right? So for example, me personally, I intentionally just do still images for a bunch of videos, right? Because most people hate those. Well, the people that don't hate those, ways I've met Andrew Luber, who I adore, is because they listened to the phenomenology of artists and they actually listened and they actually cared. And then they're a deep friend, right? Same with Thomas Jonkin. You intentionally create it's like
Alex Ebert is correct about this. You intentionally create sub-optimization in your signaling mechanism so that you're putting a signal out there, but it's not so good of content that people are attracted to the content as opposed to the heart or message, if you will, right? So by creating an intentionally suboptimal video, the probability of attracting people that are actually interested in the heart of things goes up, right? Like if you have like a conversation that's also getting into thinkers like Heidegger, well, and especially if it's not just a video, let me tell you the 10 best ideas of Heidegger, like those intro to philosophy videos that are everywhere, right? If it's just going into Claren with Andrew Luber or going in with Thomas Wynne, that automatically is a filtration system for people who actually care about the heart of what Heidegger is getting at, not just to have trivia data, right? So you intentionally create filter systems that greatly skyrocket the probability of the people that then say, hey, can we meet? Can we have a they email you. Then it transitions from content consumption into relationality thanks to the very sub-optimization of the channel, right? So you have to, but that kind of method, okay? This is the liminal web affords a new age of conversational experimentation, a new age of signaling experimentation, of exploring ideas. Like, for example, someone like Jonathan Rousing is talking about the anti-debate. We do the net, SenseSpace, VoiceCraft. These are different models of conversational experimentation because we're all looking. Aristotle talks about the mean, which is not merely the middle, but the fitting ratio of what is necessary for things to be optimal, right? So when you're talking about the fool, right, there's a mean there. If you're too intentional, it doesn't work. But if you're too unintentional, it doesn't work. So you have to go in with a certain knowledge to be the fool, but also not overdo it. That's called the mean, okay? And Aristotle, that's the mean. Guess what? The mean changes situation from situation. Guess what? It changes from content to content. You must become skilled in judging the mean. And nobody knows how to do it, and it's a matter of skill. So you do a bunch of experiments. You do a bunch of training sessions. You do a bunch of attempts in trying to figure out, you try different conversational structures. You take on different things because you're training in order to save the human, basically, we have to get good at judging the mean. The average person has to be good at judging the mean, which is really hard. And it requires basically and we don't as a civilization know how to do it. We're grappling in the dark. Please, Tim.
The way I hear judging the mean, in my language, I would say something like discerning integrity.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, because Aristotle, the mean is virtue. Like the mean is virtue. Like virtue is a matter of discerning the mean. You cannot be virtuous if you cannot discern the mean. That's why Aristotle's virtue ethics are so problematically conflated with utilitarianism, because you can't generalize virtue ethics. There is no system of how to make everyone more moral, right? No, if you want to make people virtuous, it's all about habits. It's all about discernment. It's all about risk. It's all about patience. It's all about skill, conversation. All of these things are about learning how to discern integrity, right? What is the integratable thing to do right here, right? Well, that's not easy. And you're not taught that. That's not information. That's the problem. There is no information. There are no facts of the mean, because the mean is found in the realm of facts, so cannot be a fact itself. It is the relation of the facts. It is the relation of the people that has to be discerned live, situation from situation, which is psychologically very, very heavy and difficult, but that is what is required for the harmony of global pluralism. That is what is required for the extension of humanity. There is only a hard road. There is no easy road now. There is only a hard road. But with the social coordination mechanism, we can do it. We can have friends along the way. And it's a hard road, but it's also a beautiful road. Because the beautiful is found on the hard, but we're experimenting. We're trying different ways. Like, how do I go into a conversation and bring just enough of the gesture to help the topic of the liminal web from just becoming like ostracized and simple? How do I complicate it, but not in a way that's just the nihilistic Joker figure, right? That is actually seriously a necessary non-rational roles for conversations to avoid game theory dynamics where they solidify. And basically every serious conversation, to make a massive claim, every serious conversation in the world on the news, on colleges, in institutions are profoundly susceptible to rational impasses where they cannot advance beyond their own self-symmetry and thus die. because they don't have a way to coordinate conversations like the social coordination mechanism to avoid the rational impasses and the game theory dynamics that emerge that solidify all into this kind of ethos or zeitgeist that has a life of its own beyond the people. Because when you're emphasizing relationality, what I hear in that is, how do we keep central the people here as opposed to the forces over us that are guiding us, right? Because to be in a social world is to already be susceptible to zeitgeist, if you will, some sort of spirit of thinking, some sort of preset logic. So to say, I want to focus on relations, what I hear you saying is, how do we not lose ourselves in that thing over us? Some people call it capital. Some people call it zeitgeist. Some people call it the logic of society. But the idea is that we as human beings are always under a trajectory. We're always under something that is moving, like the mouse in a little hallway, or all the Kafka novels. I'll make a giant claim. All of the Franz Kafka novels are about this problem, where we are actually being pulled along by something beyond ourselves, that if we lose sight of relationality, we get pulled along, right? So the choice of keeping relationality central is precisely the choice to not be pulled along by a force that takes us somewhere we don't want to frickin' go. But you see, here's the problem. No one intends to be taken somewhere they don't want to go. No one intends to be the angel of history in the Cleat poem. No one intends to end up in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Nobody intends to be in multipolar traps or controlled by institutional incentives, but they are. I would like to argue one of the reasons because we've lacked the infrastructure by which to experiment on ways to get around that. And we've not created ways for people to gather to say things that get us out of yes men. Because what you're saying too, like the liminal web, this space creates a place where you don't have the yes man. You can avoid the yes man. What gets governments and everyone in trouble? The yes man. I'll give it to Jacob. This affords a space to avoid those tunnel visions, those trajectories that are going to just lead us inevitably to another Cuban Missile Crisis or another multipolar trap or another Nazi equilibria. But that requires bringing people together who put the relations first and the topic second. They put the relations first and the subject matter second, because they always fall, because keeping the relations central is what matters, and forget the topic, which ironically means the topic flourishes, because the topic doesn't end up in the that's the paradox, is it doesn't end up in the rational impasses. Jacob.
Yeah, fuck the yes man. I think this actually touches on an area that's very alive for me, which is something like, well, really in the context of men's work, I think, like a space in which there's an intentional movement, like specifically the circle I've been in with Jordan Bates. We've gone through so many different archetypes and energies and flavors over the course of like I've been in that circle for 20 months now, like weekly. And like we've been through like such like pure, like ever innocent hearted topics. But then we've gone into like the month of the gangster, which was like the one we did a little while ago. And it was so fucking alchemical and amazing what came through during that month. And I think I've been thinking a lot about the spiritual gangster and like what's the integration of those. And I feel like there's something in that. There's some salt, there's some juice in there that's really important for liminal web type spaces, which do have a bias more towards like conscientious, spiritual, kind of highly balanced type vibe. And you think about the people who are most agentic, some of the most agentic and effective people on the world stage right now are the ones who are most disliked. Actually being subject to an immense amount of dislike and projection is an essential requirement to playing at the big table.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Right now. So in a sense, if we're confronting that more, then it's it could be viewed as a preliminary step to playing a bigger game. And I feel like I'm always in a little bit of a dance with myself of like sensing into areas and things that are very alive for me, but I know have the potential to be polarizing, and working to like really like bring that shit out in as elegant a way as I can, but ultimately getting to a point where I'm bringing out the stuff that to some degree invites that opposition, because like that in a way, it gives me power to bring those things forth, because it shows that I'm not governed by fear of what other people think about me, you know? And yeah.
Yeah,
I
well,
I actually have a huge amount of
yeah,
dissonance with many groups that I'm going into right now, where everybody is very, very heavy, pessimistic, or in a vibe of dread about the current U.S. administration. And I actually am feeling a lot of positive energy and potential around it. But I face this precise problem in that area, which is like, am I willing to confront all of the neuroses and attack and projection that's going to come when I actually simply try and articulate, like, this is how I'm seeing it right now. This is the vibe I'm having. And actually it's, you know, fairly positive. So again, the liminal web in a sort of closed space sense is the space where you can like really fuck around, experiment, and show up in different ways. Really important. And be seen in relationships which are committed to relationship more than like you as the particular kind of you that I signed on for at the start. And two, that you can start to land and bring in those pieces of yourself that, you know, maybe exiled or alienated, but actually contain the salt that makes you just like a force to be reckoned with in the world.
Yes, but Tim, please.
well, I was just gonna say I would love to stick around for like 10 minutes after we turn the recording button off. So I'm just gonna hold now and just say thank you. And for anybody who's still listening, I hope that, you know, you enjoyed this and found value in it. And I apologize if I, you know, indulged for like a few seconds too long at some points. Hopefully I didn't at all. But regardless, you know, I appreciate you. So appreciate you all as well.
Yeah. Well, let's try and wrap up in the next few minutes then, Daniel.
Yes. No, magnificent. I agree. Wonderful to have you. You also made the point of feeling like, for me, conversation, like on this idea, most conversations feel like they land. What I wanted to say, my experience is conversations take a step. I make a distinction in my mind between stepping and landing. I do think you want every conversation to take a step. But landing for me is different. Landing means it's over, like it's the end of it. So, but actually, funny enough, stepping is actually more in the realm of orbiting and working and emerging. So conversations to me, you do want them to be stepping, but you want to be careful before you make an idol of landing. It depends on what you mean by the language, of course, right?
But 100%. And so to clarify, in my imagination, and I agree with it as you've stated, in my imagination, part of the landing together is just so that we don't end it and then we're all just like flung off and hit the ground in a hard way. Do you know what I mean? It's kind of more like, you know, in the context of the bubble or the craft that is this particular constellation, in a sense, like being respectful around the ways that we enter and leave so as to then return to the other responsibilities we have. There's a sense in which dropping you off at the front door of your house rather than kicking you out of a plane 10,000 foot above, right, without a parachute is like maybe not the best way to re-enter that other context of belonging. The hard road but soft landings, where that soft landing in a sense is that context of belonging in which you actually do belong, in which we actually are received, is something like that we could open up into. But yeah, thank you, Jacob, as well.
No, that's beautifully put. And, you know, again, and the other thing that I would say is like another reason, like I was saying about the liminal and the father and hate, and it's difficult. Like one of the reasons I force myself, you know, like talking about like Paul or the liminality, or like if there's a negativity you feel in it, one of the reasons why it's good to face it is because you will secretly disavow it. Like there are many Christians, for example, who want to talk about Jesus but not talk about Paul, right? Well, actually, Paul ends up with dealing with the problem of actually how to form live communities who are following this, and people are like, oh, he creates dogmas and he destroys the whole thing. Well, he's actually facing the difficult thing of live community, right? So it's really, so you don't want to disavow Paul, but you also want to see problems that are left if you don't have Jesus. Likewise, you say, well, you're glad, there's a gratitude for the things that are open up in the liminal web, and you want to acknowledge that, but then you also want to, as we've done here, talk about there's a real problem if it just stays, it doesn't move into the thing that is being pointed to as participation and the voice craft and things like that, right? So like bringing that all out and actually learning to face it. Well, and the other thing too that I think is basically a reason why I think philosophy is important is because, like Jacob, you're talking about facing that negativity. I actually think philosophy is necessary to be inside of your internal space. So when you face negativity, you can actually work with it and like turn it into something rather it destroy you. Like philosophy is taught about just kind of metaphysical ideas. There's something in that mental flexibility that actually helps you be able to deal with negativity. And this was the key point I wanted to say. Basically, institutions are such that because they are all controlled now by Nash equilibrium and rational impasse, the way you deal with a rational impasse is to do something non-rational, okay? Like in the movie Beautiful Mind, if everyone's doing what's rational and they're ending up not getting a date, then you do the non-rational thing and walk out of the bar, and then actually you become the cool guy that all the women want because you weren't even interested in picking something. So you did something that was non-rational, that seemed like it wasn't rational, and that's actually what opens up a solution to the problem, right? Likewise, if you have multipolar traps, what you end up doing is actually not just creating more, what the rational thing to do would be to build up your armaments. Like if Kennedy would have done what was rational in the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is he would have actually just bombed all the missile silos, we would have had World War II. Instead, he did something non-rational. He had a blockade without declaring a declaration of war, and then he also had a process where an emissary, it's really kind of a complicated picture of communication, but he did something that was not rational to the military generals. It was stupid. But actually that non-rational is what got us through the problem. So non-rationality, which we can also associate with menti-divergence, as I call it in Belong Again, or neurodiversity, you could also say, to use those loosely, is what gets you through these problems. Here's the problem. Right now, the world is being run basically by sociopaths. Why? Because the sociopath is the one who thinks differently and gets through the institutional incentives and doesn't care what people think, and therefore they rise to the top. Here's the problem. They're friggin' sociopaths, right? So, but if we want to change that, you have to be able to think differently, like the sociopath thinks, or the dark triad, people talk about that, and not be a sociopath. Well, how in the world do you do that? Because people who are like, not sociopaths, they really feel rejection. The whole point of a sociopath is they literally don't feel rejection. So there's this idea they have a gangster attitude, like you're saying, Jacob, there's value, but there's also it's important to realize the people who often are at the top with the gangster attitude, they literally don't feel emotions the same way. And I'm not trying to make fun of them. It actually becomes a great strength, but it also comes with negatives. Well, if you want to change the institutions, you literally have to talk about people coming into positions of leadership of which to get through institutional incentives requires something that's like neurodiverse, but not be sociopath, not be psychopath, not be a lack of empathy. Like you can be menti-diverse by not having empathy. That's a wonderful way to get to the top, is actually just not having empathy, like killing that part of your brain, right? So we now basically, because the only ones who are going to excel with institutional logic are the ones that basically think differently, the incentives are to get rid of the more human sides of you, to get rid of empathy, to get rid of communication, to become more kind of power-driven, right? Well, if you want the alternative, then you literally will have to learn how to develop a different way of thinking that doesn't fall to institutional incentives, but isn't different because of the dark triad. I see no other way to do that than by philosophy or voicecraft or what we're doing here. This social coordination mechanism is literally training different menti-divergent ways of thinking, which is not merely becoming more rational or smarter. It's literally a different mode of thinking. That's different from more information or rational, like the social coordinate, like you're habituating a different mode of thinking. Well, in it being a different mode, it becomes possible to go beyond game theory dynamics without doing so because of the dark triad, right? But that has to be trained, that has to be habituated, and it is hard and requires practices and ways of talking, and it's a much more difficult road. So therefore, it's simply practical that the people who are just more sociopath, they just shoot to the top because they don't have to go through the practices. They don't have to go through the thousands of lessons of learning how to have a different way of thinking that isn't just the dark triad. The system right now makes a really fast path to those who give into the dark triad, basically, right? And so that becomes rational. Oh no, it's rational. Oh crap. So basically, if you don't want to do that, which is the only way to get through the institutional incentives, you have to develop a different mode of consciousness by a different road. But that's not given. That has to be made. That has to be habituated. And it has to be done by the slow, patient work of the concept. And it has to be done in a faithful presence. And that's what the social coordination mechanism makes possible. And that's what has to be done here. because it's not going to be done in the colleges because of institutional incentives. It's not going to be done in the economic incentives because of institutional incentives. It has to be done by definition outside of it. And in being outside of it, it is possible to cultivate a menti-divergence that can avoid the incentive structures that lead to all of these game A or meta-crisis problems that people are talking about, or the dark triad.
Bingo.
Yeah, tag in potential critique of Girard in there as well for a later conversation, because I find, I mean, and so this is just provocative. I might not even going to go into it, but you know, my sense is that well, I'll just leave it at that. I'll just leave it at that, because this can't be imitated either. It can't be imitated. It can't be mimesis in the straight way, and so tacit, you know, ways of seeing the world which don't make room for unicity in genuine participation. And then we're talking about things like, well, how do you the nature of an ideal? Anyway, that's it.
Thank you.
Desire is mimetic, but not drive. So I have a lot to say on Girard. Desire is mimetic.
No. I have to be merciful upon our non-extremist listeners at this point.
I know, I'm sorry.
No, it's a wonderful question. Cleo has an amazing piece on Girard. Cleo Kearns, she's got an amazing piece on Girard. Jacob Kishere.
To summarize what Daniel was saying, I think, you know, the world is run by gangsters, and the liminal web is a lot of spiritual people. And in order to bridge that gap, the people in the liminal web have to discover their spiritual gangster. Another way of thinking about this, and I think probably the most dangerous delusion of the liminal web, which I certainly fell prey to, is the belief that we're going from game A, rivalrous dynamics, to game B as this other place, like an A to B, when in fact, the reality is much more game A with game B on top, and navigating the tension between the two, and being honest about that. And so, yeah, the more of the raw reality we can bring out, the better. And insofar as philosophy helps me get more dates through non-rational means, I will be a much happier philosopher. And on that note, thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you all.